For the main titles, the producer Hunt Stromberg Jr. decided to start with the opening of a red, leather-bound book to a page where there are several pressed flowers. The center one, a Japanese camellia, seemingly dried and dead, comes to vibrant life again via time-lapse photography, beautifully designed and executed by titles and matte painter Peter Melrose, known for his complex opening moonscape in The Fearless Vampire Killers. Headshots of each star fade up in the center of the bloom as the credits appear, with the exception of "and Michael Sarrazin as the creature," which is superimposed over the flower with no accompanying image of his face, keeping his look a mystery. After all, the creature is the efflorescence of this story. As we all know, a cut flower rapidly wilts. When placed in a vase of water, though, it can be revived to its former beauty, but only for a brief period of time before it will eventually wither to the point of no return. This was an arresting metaphor for the resurrection and inevitable deterioration of the creature. The majestic orchestral score was composed by Gil Millay, Golden Globe Award nominee for his groundbreaking electronic score to The Andromeda Strain and his iconic theme to Rod Serling's Night Gallery series. Millay was hired after John Barry, Maurice Jarre, Richard Rodney Bennett, and Michel Legrand had passed on the project. Millay came to the UK and worked with Hammer Film's regular music supervisor, Philip Martell. The score was recorded at Anvil Studios by a 100-piece symphony orchestra. The production was based outside London at Pinewood Studios. The nearby Virginia Water Lake was used when Victor Frankenstein's brother, William, dives out of a rowboat and drowns. I interviewed Carl Homan, who played William, and he told me, "The director wanted me to dive off the boat and then swim underneath the boat, come up the other side where they can't see me, and wait for him to yell, 'Cut.' Now, I wasn't a great swimmer, but I did it. Came up the other side, listened, and thought I heard, 'Cut!' So I climbed back in the boat, but the shot was still in progress, and I'd ruined it. The director said, 'We'll have to do it again.'" Character actor Martin Reed of Juggernaut played the priest at William's funeral. St. Mary, the Virgin Church in Hambledon Village, Buckinghamshire, served as the location for the scene, also used in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and Sleepy Hollow. The role of Elizabeth, fiancée of Victor Frankenstein, was played by Nicola Paget, who had been seen in such films as Anne of a Thousand Days and Hammer Film's The Viking Queen. But it was her role as Elizabeth Bellamy on the first 2 seasons of Upstairs Downstairs that made her a recognizable star in England. As luck would have it, the director, Jack Smite, happened to catch an episode of Upstairs Downstairs shortly after arriving in England and was immediately taken with Paget. He grabbed the phone, called the producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., got him to turn on his TV, and soon he was equally intrigued. At first, Paget was skeptical. She told me, "I thought it was another Hammer horror, but couldn't have been more wrong." When she read the script, she wanted to be in it so badly, she got out of her commitment to star in the stage production of Tom Stoppard's The House of Bernarda Alba. Mia Farrow took over the role in her place. Coincidentally, Farrow had just turned down the role of Prima, the female creature, in Frankenstein the True Story. Other actresses who had been approached to play Elizabeth prior to Nicola Paget included Julie Christie and Olivia Hussey. For the role of Sir Richard Fanshawe, father of Elizabeth, the producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., cast longtime friend Michael Wilding, star of 2 Alfred Hitchcock films, Under Capricorn and Stage Fright. Despite his many credits, however, Wilding was perhaps most widely recognized as having been the second of Elizabeth Taylor's 7 husbands. Stromberg was doing Wilding a favor because he knew the actor was suffering from a disorder that impaired his vocal cords. It sounded like laryngitis when I met him in 1974. Graham Hartstone, sound re-recording mixer for Frankenstein the True Story, told me that Wilding's voice had to be post-dubbed by Robert Reity, who had famously dubbed the entire role of the villain Largo in Thunderball because Adolfo Celi's Italian accent was too thick. Sadly, Frankenstein the True Story would turn out to be Wilding's final screen appearance. He died in 1979. The most lavish location in the movie was Clevedon, a ginormous mansion in Taplow, Berkshire, that portrayed the exterior of the Fanshawe estate, home of Elizabeth and her parents. Built in 1851, Clevedon became the residence of Lord and Lady Astor in 1893. For movies, Clevedon had been used to double Buckingham Palace in the Beatles film Help, and was featured in the yellow Rolls-Royce, and the Alec Guinness movie The Promoter, co-starring Valerie Hobson, who played Elizabeth in Bride of Frankenstein. Ms. Hobson has another connection to the property because in 1963, Clevedon became notorious as the setting for the Profumo affair, where Hobson's husband, John Profumo, carried on his tryst with Christine Keeler. Though it will forever be infamous as the Profumo love nest, Clevedon is now a world-famous resort under managing director Johann Tam, husband of actress Jenny Agutter of Logan's Run and Captain America: The Winter Soldier. "24 miles from Pinewood Studios, Hambledon Village in Buckinghamshire was used for the Crossroads sequence where Dr. Frankenstein insists on taking an injured man to the hospital in his carriage. Arnold Diamond, who had appeared in Hammer Film's Revenge of Frankenstein and Paranoiac, played the impatient coach passenger. Diamond had recently co-starred with Leonard Whiting on British television in My Brother's House, but the primary reason he was cast in the role was because Frankenstein the True Story director Jack Smite had just recently directed him in an episode of NBC's Madigan that was filmed on location in London, guest starring Fiona Lewis. The injured accident victim, who gets his arm amputated, was played by David Weston, who had previously co-starred with Vincent Price in The Mask of the Red Death. In 1966, Weston played the title role in Walt Disney's The Legend of Young Dick Turpin, which happened to co-star 15-year-old Leonard Whiting as a pickpocket named Jimmy the Dip. Weston told me it was a very small role, but a very well-paid job because we shot the first interior scene when I'm having my arm cut off by David McCallum, and then later we shot the outdoor scene where Leonard Whiting sees that my arm is injured and takes me to the hospital in his coach. There were 2 months between these scenes, and I was paid the whole time to be on hold, so it was a very good salary by the end. Mainly a stage actor for the Royal Shakespeare Company, Weston authored a humorous memoir covering McKellen, an understudy's tale, recounting his chaotic experiences as understudy for Sir Ian McKellen on a tour of King Lear. Mrs. McGregor, the head nurse at the hospital, was played by Eutha Joyce, who had appeared with Dirk Bogarde in Jack Clayton's Our Mother's House and with Tallulah Bankhead in Hammer Film's Die, Die, My Darling. The location for these sequences was St. Mary Abbott's Hospital in Kensington, which had a Dickensian wing that had been closed off for many decades and was perfectly preserved. After Sean Connery had passed on the role of Dr. Henry Clerval, they decided to cast another handsome Scotland-born actor who was similarly famous for playing a secret agent, 3-time Emmy nominee David McCallum, widely known as Russian spy Ilya Kuryakin in NBC's The Man from U.N.C.L.E. A profile in London's Sunday Times stated, David McCallum was to espionage what Paul McCartney was to pop. He used to receive more than 30,000 fan letters a month when he appeared in the television spy series. Previously, McCallum had made his mark in a number of major motion pictures, including Roy Ward Baker's A Night to Remember, John Huston's Freud, John Sturgis's The Great Escape, and George Stevens' The Greatest Story Ever Told. But his role in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. had eclipsed all that. Just as Connery was trying to shed his association with James Bond, McCallum was now trying to shake his typecasting. Much of the work he'd been doing since U.N.C.L.E. was for Universal Television, including a guest spot on Night Gallery and a starring role opposite Robert Wagner in Colditz, a prisoner of war series filmed in England. In a 1973 interview, McCallum explained, Hunt Stromberg telephoned and said they were doing another Frankenstein, and I laughed heartily and said, not again. I had no intention of doing it, but when I read Christopher Isherwood's script, I changed my mind. In fact, I jumped at the part. It's a wonderful script. I asked McCallum about the amputation scene, and he told me I wanted it to be believable, so I got them to get a piece of wood and nail it to the operating table where the man's arm would be, out of sight of camera. So when they shot the scene, I saw through the piece of wood and it fell on the floor. The resistance made it believable. In case you have been wondering about the actor playing Dr. Frankenstein, we finally have a breather to delve into that. Up until 1973, the two youngest actors to play Dr. Frankenstein were Colin Clive, 31, in James Whale's Frankenstein, and Ralph Bates, 30, in Hammer Films' The Horror of Frankenstein. The producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., felt that Frankenstein's inexperience was vital to the story, and therefore he became determined to cast the youngest actor ever to play the part. Stromberg was quoted in The Hollywood Reporter saying, "I felt the creature should be created out of the madness of youth, and that Dr. Frankenstein should be young." So while reviewing casting director Sally Nicole's list of available young hunks, the name Leonard Whiting practically leapt off the page. The 22-year-old actor had become world famous 5 years earlier, starring in Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, which was Oscar-nominated for Best Picture and Best Director. Whiting himself had won the Golden Globe Award for Most Promising Male Newcomer. The film was also noted for casting the youngest actors ever seen in the leading roles. Whiting was 17, and Olivia Hussey was only 15. What really grabbed headlines, though, was that both appeared naked on screen, fleetingly, with Whiting butt naked on the bed the morning after they had consummated their relationship. It was tastefully done, mind you, but highly provocative considering their ages. Amazingly, because the movie was Shakespeare, many schools across America took students in groups to see the film, yours truly among them at age 12. Despite its brief nudity, which was deemed academically artistic. Hormones raged from coast to coast and abroad, resulting in relentless coverage in teen magazines whipping up Beatles like hysteria. In a 1969 interview conducted by Rex Reed, Whiting said, "Now, suddenly, I'm in a business I used to respect for its art, and I'm doing a nude scene. I don't think they put that nude scene in the movie for any other reason than money and publicity, and that bothers me, so I don't know if I can become an actor like Orson Welles and Marlon Brando, because you have to do a lot of things you don't believe in to get anywhere. I don't want to be a star." But whether he liked it or not, he already was one, and his fans were clamoring for more. Despite his reluctance, Whiting, still just 17, went on to star opposite Robert Shaw and Christopher Plummer in Peter Shaffer's The Royal Hunt of the Sun. At age 18, played the title role in Casanova. At 19, romanced 41-year-old Gene Simmons in Say Hello to Yesterday. And at 20, starred opposite Kurt Jurgens in War is Hell. None of these movies, however, had the impact of Romeo and Juliet. In 2016, Whiting told me, "My name may as well have been Romeo at the time. That's what I was famous for, and it was pretty much foremost in the public's mind." My agent, Jimmy Frazier, called and said they wanted me for the lead in a Frankenstein movie. He set up a meeting for me with the producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr. I read the script, which I liked very much, and then they had me do a screen test with Nicola Paget, who I got on with tremendously well, a marvelous actress. The test was shot at a church near Pinewood Studios with Jack Smite directing. I asked if the producer was present at the screen test. Whiting laughed. "Oh, absolutely. Hunt was omnipresent. He'd be at the opening of an envelope. And his partner, Jacques, was there too, Jacques Shelton. They were always together. One day I asked Hunt, 'How did you meet your partner?' And he said, 'On the set of Rawhide.' Now, I didn't know whether that was a joke or what. It wasn't a joke. Jacques Shelton was a stuntman on Rawhide, which was a CBS series when Stromberg was the network's vice president of programming. After they became lovers, Stromberg gave Shelton small parts in 4 different episodes of Rawhide and a slew of bit parts on at least 15 other CBS shows, including The Twilight Zone and The Wild Wild West. Shelton was credited on Frankenstein the True Story as assistant to the producer, though from all accounts he was more like a co-producer. He also helped coordinate stunts and wrangle animals in the film, including swans and other exotic birds, which was a specialty of his. He collected them. I asked Whiting what happened after the screen test was shot. He replied, "They didn't say anything. They just looked at me and smiled and nodded, poker faces. But I felt good about what I'd done, and I thought I'd got a good chance of getting in there." Then Hunt came to me and said, "Would you mind awfully, darling, if we dye your hair reddish blonde?" I said, "Why is that, Hunt?" He said, "Because it's beginning to look like a Sicilian movie. Because you see, Nicola had dark hair, and so did Michael Sarrazin and some of the others they were casting." Hunt never failed to crack us up. He was outrageous. Whiting's Romeo baggage was precisely what Stromberg wanted for his younger and sexier Dr. Frankenstein. Stromberg also liked the fact that Whiting's height was just 5'8", which would allow Michael Sarrazin as the creature to impressively tower over him by half a foot. For producer Hunt Stromberg Jr., this production of Frankenstein was his lifelong dream project. Born in Los Angeles in 1923, Stromberg was the only child of MGM mogul Hunt Stromberg Sr., producer of The Thin Man, The Women, and the Best Picture Oscar winner The Great Ziegfeld. Even though he grew up at MGM, schooled on the lot with Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, the films Stromberg loved the most were Universal's horror movies. At the age of 11, Stromberg actually met Elsa Lanchester when she was simultaneously filming The Bride of Frankenstein at Universal and his father's production of Naughty Marietta at MGM. He had already met Boris Karloff 2 years earlier when he starred in his father's production of The Mask of Fu Manchu. At age 24, Stromberg produced a stage play with Bela Lugosi entitled Three Indelicate Ladies, and in 1954 he switched mediums to television, where he created and produced The Vampira Show, featuring his discovery, Mila Nurmi, as Vampira, the macabre hostess of late-night horror movies. To everyone's surprise, Vampira received an Emmy nomination and became an overnight national sensation. Consequently, Stromberg became Vice President of Programming for CBS, where he helped develop and oversee such iconic hit shows as The Munsters, The Twilight Zone, The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, The Wild Wild West, Lost in Space, My Favorite Martian, Perry Mason, Gilligan's Island, The Beverly Hillbillies, and many more. For a 1962 Halloween episode of Route 66, Stromberg got Boris Karloff to wear his Frankenstein monster makeup again, with Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman plus Peter Lorre. When Stromberg set up shop as an independent producer at Universal Pictures in 1970, he envisioned lavish, all-star reboots of the studio's classic monsters, beginning with Frankenstein: The True Story. His favorite movies of all time were Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, both directed by James Whale, who, like Stromberg, happened to be gay. Stromberg wanted to combine them and reimagine them into one magnum opus. Special effects technician Brian Smithies, who had worked on the sci-fi puppet film Thunderbird 6, created the large black beetle that is brought to life by Clerval. Smithies told me, "I only had about 3 weeks to make the beetle. It was a very large species called Goliathus goliatus, which was the largest one we could get at the time. I made a fiberglass cast of it and created all the internal mechanics. We managed to find these absolutely minuscule electric motors from a company called Swiss Medical Engineering. They were very powerful with tiny little gearboxes. I had to build everything around that. There was a train of gears and levers that operated so that the legs moved back and lifted and came forward." After Frankenstein: The True Story, Smithies worked on Richard Donner's Superman, John Badham's Dracula, Clash of the Titans, Dark Crystal, Dune, Aliens, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, plus the James Bond films Octopussy and Die Another Day. Makeup artist Roy Ashton, famous for his work on numerous Hammer films, was one of the makeup artists on Frankenstein: The True Story. In an interview with Little Shop of Horrors magazine, Ashton recalled, "The crawling arm in the picture was actually cast from mine. The moment when the amputated arm grabs Leonard Whiting's hand was shot in close-up in order to use a real forearm and hand for the action. Roy Ashton's own arm was drafted into service for this gripping moment. Since he had molded the fake version from his own arm, and he'd shaved the hair off his arm for the molding process, it was a perfect match in every way."
It knows you. Get it off! But it has quite a will of its
The production designer was Wilfred Shingleton, who had won an Oscar for David Lean's Great Expectations and a BAFTA for John Guillermin's The Blue Max. His other impressive credits included John Huston's The African Queen, David Lean's Hobson's Choice, Jack Clayton's The Innocents, and two of Roman Polanski's most visually lavish films, The Fearless Vampire Killers and Macbeth. At the age of 18, Shingleton began his career as a junior assistant in the art department at Ealing Studios, which happened to be located near his family's home. He quickly worked his way up the ranks and became the head of the art department from 1938 to 1941, designing such films as Carol Reed's Penny Paradise and Marcel Vernal's To Hell with Hitler. His job was interrupted by military duty during World War II, for which his experience was put to good use designing naval camouflage. For Frankenstein the True Story, Shingleton designed the largest laboratory ever constructed for a Frankenstein film up to that time. In fact, everything in the movie was big, especially the eye-popping budget of $3.5 million. To put that number in perspective, Hammer Films' contemporaneous Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell was made for only $300,000. The biggest theatrical movies of the early 70s were still being budgeted in the seven-digit range. Live and Let Die, $7 million. Earthquake, $7 million. The Godfather, $6 million. The Poseidon Adventure, $5 million. Young Frankenstein, $2.8 million. The French Connection, $1.8 million. Taxi Driver, $1.5 million. And Murder on the Orient Express, $1.4 million. Made-for-television movies during that era were rarely budgeted higher than $450,000, often considerably less. So when Universal committed $3.5 million to make Frankenstein the True Story, it was earth-shaking. Not only was the budget greater than many major studio theatrical releases, it was by far the highest budget of any made-for-television movie up to that time. It also happened to be the most money ever spent on a horror movie up until then. Mary Shelley's book never explains how Dr. Frankenstein brings his creature to life. Electrical charges generated from lightning originated in James Whale's Frankenstein and became the standard for nearly every Frankenstein movie since. Stromberg strived to avoid the obvious tropes of the genre, especially this one. In a 1973 interview for The Hollywood Reporter, Stromberg said, "Frankenstein was a challenge because it had been done so much. I wanted to do several firsts. I didn't want the creature created at midnight with lightning and a storm, because we'd seen all that before." During pre-production, Stromberg was suddenly struck with the notion that his creature must be brought to life in broad daylight by solar power. The writers were not so gung-ho about the idea. Christopher Isherwood noted in his diary, "This seemed an idiotic notion for England where the weather is so unreliable, but we said sure. In spite of their misgivings, Isherwood and his partner, Don Bacardi, met with production designer Wilfred Shingleton to discuss what might feasibly be done. Isherwood noted, "At the end of 2 hours, we had recklessly and shamelessly invented the whole process of conveying solar energy to storage batteries by means of mirrors. When Dr. Frankenstein is gathering rays of the sun to power the solar batteries, he adjusts a circular series of solar panels that light up with a brilliant, almost blinding white light. When asked if this was a post-production optical effect, Brian Smithies told me, 'No, we covered those panels with a material called Scotch light. It was new at the time, made by 3M. It's a highly reflective, retro-reflective material that is now used for movie theater screens. It is a cloth material coated with millions of tiny glass beads. You shine a light at it, and it will send a reflection straight back at the source. It's the principle of the headlights of a car hitting the eyes of a cat in the road. You know how it makes the eyes glow? That's what happens with every bead." For the role of Lady Fanshawe, they cast Australian actress Clarissa Kay. At age 42, she would be 15 years older than her daughter in the film, played by 27-year-old Nicola Paget. Previously, Kay had played the mother of Mick Jagger in Tony Richardson's Ned Kelly. She also happened to be the real-life wife of James Mason, the top-billed star of Frankenstein the True Story. Kay and Mason would appear together again in the Stephen King miniseries Salem's Lot. The producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., desperately wanted his longtime family friend, Elsa Lanchester, to play the landlady, Mrs. Blair. Lanchester, of course, had played the title role in Bride of Frankenstein, and it would have been a publicity coup to have her pop up in another Universal Frankenstein film 38 years later. Amazingly, Lanchester happened to live in Santa Monica right next door to the screenwriters of Frankenstein the True Story, and was eager to do the role until her agent reminded her that she had a prior commitment to appear in a low-budget horror film called Arnold the very same month. Stromberg also struck out with Bette Davis and Ingrid Bergman. He finally convinced his dear friend Agnes Moorehead to play the part. Moorehead had won an Emmy, 2 Golden Globes, and had been nominated for 4 Oscars, not to mention her iconic role as Endora on Bewitched. Moorehead was a devout Christian, often arriving on set with a Bible in one hand and her script in the other. Nevertheless, she was twice divorced and often socialized with a coterie of gay friends, including Stromberg and her Bewitched co-stars Paul Lynde and Dick Sargent. When I directed Sargent in a Showtime thriller, Acting on Impulse, in 1992, he confided to me that Moorehead had never officially come out as a lesbian, but privately would let her guard down when she felt safe among like-minded friends. Stromberg based the character of the landlady on Minnie, the skittish housekeeper in Bride of Frankenstein, played by Una O'Connor. As luck would have it, Moorehead had worked with O'Connor in RKO's Government Girl, so she had a ball affecting O'Connor's thick Irish accent and hamming it up for all it's worth.
You need not worry about the proprieties. I brought one of the maids with me. And as for letting you know, if I had, I might have been told I was unwelcome.
In this scene, Henry Clerval clearly disapproves of Dr. Frankenstein's fiancée showing up unannounced and distracting them from their work. However, his unwelcoming and hostile attitude toward her is so pronounced, it seems to suggest an undercurrent of jealousy. Is it possible that Clerval sees Frankenstein as more than just a colleague? It struck me that way when I first saw the film, and as the story progressed, so did the gay subtext. Or at least that's how it appeared to me. After years of wondering if I was reading things into the movie that were unintended, I finally discovered that I had been right all along. The famous gay couple, Christopher Isherwood and Don Bacardi, were recruited by Stromberg to write the script for Frankenstein the True Story. Isherwood had written many novels, including the Berlin Stories, on which the movie Cabaret was based, winning Liza Minnelli an Oscar, and A Single Man, that earned Colin Firth an Oscar nomination. He had also written a number of screenplays, including Rage in Heaven, The Sinner, and The Loved One. His lover, Don Bacardi, is the renowned portrait artist whose works are held in the collections of many of the most prestigious art museums around the world. I asked Bacardi if they had intentionally infused their adaptation of Frankenstein with gay subtext. He told me, "Yes, very much so. We were amusing ourselves. We worked those elements into the script the way we wanted to. Luckily, we had a very intelligent producer in Hunt Stromberg." In fact, Stromberg encouraged them at every turn, facetiously declaring himself to be the kingpin of the Lavender Hill mob. The scheme flew right over the heads of the studio, the network, and many viewers. It even escaped the notice of their Dr. Frankenstein, Leonard Whiting, who told me, "I never knew anything about it. The producer didn't sit down with me and say, 'Listen, you know, this is obviously a homoerotic thing.'" Nevertheless, the signs were everywhere for those who had their gaydar on high alert. In studying early drafts of the script, I discovered an unused scene in which Dr. Frankenstein goes to a brothel where Henry Clerval invites him to participate in a three-way with one of the female prostitutes. Frankenstein demurs, preferring to watch from the sidelines so he will retain his virginity for his wedding night with Elizabeth. Hurt by this rejection, Clerval lashes out, saying, "No man would marry while he still has any genius or ambition left in him. Marriage is fatal to the man of science." Not only does Clerval share the same brazen sexual fluidity of his prologue counterpart, Lord Byron, his petulant and misogynistic outburst seems motivated by having been jilted. I'll address more about this later as it evolves. In this scene, Frankenstein has invited Elizabeth to return at the appointed time so he can show her the result of their experiment to reanimate a butterfly. He hides in the shadows to see her reaction when she discovers that the dead butterfly has been resurrected. Brian Smithies, the mechanical effects wizard who created the beetle a few scenes back, also created a mechanized butterfly for this scene. Smithies told me, "I cast a butterfly body and then obtained some real butterfly wings. Little spring metal supports went up the wings. These were hinged at the bottom. Coming off the hinge was a tag that I connected with another tag using a tiny little homemade rubber band. It was fairly intricate. To get it airborne, I mounted it on the end of a very thin wire on a fishing rod. It was tungsten wire, the wire they use in light bulbs. It's so thin the camera lens doesn't see it. Then I had to operate it with the feeling of a butterfly flitting about the room." Shooting this sequence was difficult because it was so technical, getting the butterfly to perform believably for the camera. But Stromberg kept everyone in a good mood, cracking jokes. In my interview with Nicola Paget, she said, "Hunt nicknamed me Nanook, after Nanook of the North, the old movie about the family who lived in the Arctic. Remember those popular 1970s winter coats that were white and looked like they came from Tibet? I wore mine all the time. Hunt took one look at me in that old, dirty, flea-bitten white coat, because I didn't look very smart, and he called me Nanook of the North. And the nickname stuck. I must say, Hunt was very affable, and he was absolutely dedicated to treating us all extremely well. He wined and dined us, gave us gifts. He wanted everyone to be happy and did everything in his power to make us laugh."
I shouldn't have startled her like that. But if she has prejudices, it's just the fault of her education. Henry, I know I can trust her. She'll be a comrade to us. She'll inspire us in our work.
The writers took a very bold chance when they decided to have Elizabeth kill the butterfly. The modus operandi would be a book, but not just any book. It was a Bible. They never thought it would pass the censors, and yet it did, with nary a peep. The search for a director to helm Frankenstein the True Story was a saga unto itself. Stromberg initially wanted Franco Zeffirelli of Romeo and Juliet fame, but he was not interested in doing a made-for-television movie. Mervyn LeRoy, who had directed Little Women and Gypsy, was also approached, but early signs of Alzheimer's disease made it apparent that he wasn't up to the task. Sid Sheinberg, president of Universal Television, suddenly assigned the project to Boris Sagal, who had recently directed The Omega Man starring Charlton Heston, based on Richard Matheson's novel I Am Legend. However, neither the writers nor Stromberg were happy with the choice, and soon Sagal had parted ways over creative differences. Hot off The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola read the script and begged Universal to let him direct the film as a theatrical feature starring Marlon Brando as Dr. Polidori. But Coppola had gone $1 million over budget on The Godfather and was considered unreliable. The same was true of John Boorman, hot off of Deliverance, who wrote an impassioned plea to the top brass of Universal, pitching himself as director with Jon Voight as Dr. Frankenstein and Warren Beatty as the creature, but again, only if the movie would be elevated to a theatrical release. Sheinberg simply refused to relinquish the project to the theatrical division. He believed it belonged on TV under his regime. Stromberg's attempts to sign Roman Polanski, Peter Bogdanovich, Peter Yates, Lindsay Anderson, and John Schlesinger were all thwarted by the fact that this was going to be a made-for-television film. During this period, Sheinberg's main protege in the television division was Steven Spielberg, and Sheinberg confirmed to me that there was talk of Spielberg potentially being assigned to direct the movie. But by the time it was finally going into production, Spielberg was busy directing The Sugarland Express, his first theatrical feature film. Finally, in November 1972, Universal announced that Emmy Award winner Jack Smite had been signed to direct Frankenstein the True Story. His feature film credits included Harper with Paul Newman, Kaleidoscope with Warren Beatty, plus 2 Rod Steiger movies, No Way to Treat a Lady and The Illustrated Man. In 1971, Smythe had signed an exclusive contract with Universal Television to direct TV movies and episodes of shows like Columbo. He had proven himself to be a trusted team player, and he was a good fit for Stromberg, who would continue to be the driving force behind the film. Pay close attention to the toe tags in this sequence: Lewis, Burgess, and Goddard. Deciding which limbs will be used to build their creature, Clerval remarks, "It's between Goddard and Burgess for the legs and Lewis for the arms." Well, this was an inside joke. Goddard was Ian Goddard, the location manager. Burgess stood for Brian Burgess, the production manager. And Lewis referred to Ian Lewis, the associate producer, who, by the way, had started out in the business as assistant to Michael Carreras at Hammer Films. He had production managed 3 of Hammer's most beloved films: Frankenstein Created Woman, The Devil Rides Out, and Quatermass in the Pit. Following the success of Frankenstein the True Story, Lewis would be promoted to head of Universal in the UK. Now we come to the introduction of the character played by our top-billed movie star. In early 1973, the producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., traveled to Switzerland to the home of James Mason, who by then had been Oscar-nominated twice for A Star is Born and Georgie Girl, and later received a 3rd nomination for The Verdict. His other credits included Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest, and Stanley Kubrick's Lolita. When Stromberg approached Mason, he had recently completed filming Herbert Ross's all-star whodunit The Last of Sheila, written by Stephen Sondheim and Anthony Perkins, and John Huston's The Macintosh Man opposite Paul Newman. Even though Stromberg had known Mason socially for years, he very carefully strategized his approach. In an interview, Stromberg explained, "I purposefully left the title page off because I was afraid he would turn it down as just another Frankenstein movie." Stromberg did mention that the writers were Christopher Isherwood and Don Bacardi, knowing full well that the actor knew them socially. In fact, Mason had done a sitting with Bacardi in 1962 for a portrait that can be seen in the artist's 2014 coffee table book, Hollywood. Stromberg slathered on the flattery by stating, "You are my first and only choice to play the grandiloquent Dr. Polidori." First and only choice? Seriously? I uncovered a mountain of evidence to the contrary, but more on that later. That grave robbing scene, by the way, was shot in the parish church of St. Mary Virgin in Hedgerley, Buckinghamshire. It was also used later in the film for the daytime encounter between Polidori and Frankenstein, as seen on the cover of the published teleplay. Now let's take a moment to talk about the directing style of Jack Smythe. I asked David McCallum what he thought of working with him, and he said, "When I think of Jack, I think of Midway, the World War II movie with Charlton Heston and Henry Fonda. Anybody who can direct that movie the way he did can do anything in this world. I always liked Jack. He was very workmanlike, very practical. He didn't waste a lot of time like so many other directors. He knew what he was doing, and he was wonderful." Leonard Whiting agreed, although it was nothing like being directed by Franco Zeffirelli on Romeo and Juliet. Whiting told me they had completely different attitudes. Jack Smythe was very old-school Hollywood in the sense that he always was aware of keeping everything coming in under budget and had a very workmanlike attitude towards filming. Franco Zeffirelli was more like a Renaissance Italian painter. Jack came on the set knowing exactly what he wanted versus Franco, who would come on set, work with the actors, and figure things out. Franco always wanted things to look as beautiful as they possibly could, which was the embodiment of romance, the ideology and the beauty of the old masters of Italy.
Positive? Yes. There is the living proof that our process works. Tomorrow morning, that whole body will be as perfect and unblemished as the flesh on that arm. Those eyes will open. Those limbs will move. That brain will be alive. Yes, Laird's brain. Brain of an ignorant peasant.
Well, it's a good, healthy...
Nevertheless, Jack Smythe was open to ideas from the actors. David McCallum told me, "I remember the script was very good and it called for a lot of mirrors. I'm looking in a mirror at myself in one of the early scenes when I've stolen the severed arm. My character was a narcissist, so the mirrors were a recurring theme. When we got to the laboratory scene, I was supposed to hold up a mirror and gaze at myself while giving a speech. So I went to the prop room and found this huge round mirror that would blow up and distort my face like a giant fisheye lens. I showed it to Jack Smite, and he loved it, so we put it in the scene. When Stromberg walked on set and saw McCallum's gigantic distorted face in that huge round mirror, he gasped and said, "My God, that's exactly what Boris Karloff did in my father's movie, The Mask of Fu Manchu."
The sole creator. Here he is standing before you, alive and breathing. I present to you the second Adam.
As I mentioned earlier, the severed arm was molded from the real-life arm of makeup artist Roy Ashton. The interior mechanics were devised by special effects technician Colin Chilvers, who told me, "When we first tested it, the fingers didn't have enough traction on the floor, so we had to embed into the fingertips tiny little pins that were sticking out, so when the fingers scratched the floor, the pins dug into the surface like little ice picks and were able to pull the weight along." Roy Ashton remarked, "This was really a most eerie sort of effect, turning out much more convincing than the hand we previously used in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors." Stromberg was so impressed with the arm, he boasted to reporters that the invention was going to be merchandised. Sadly, that novelty never crawled onto store shelves. On the production side of things, Universal and Stromberg needed a British associate producer to spearhead the production in the UK, to hire local crew, and most importantly, to make sure the project qualified for the Edie levy, a rebate on box office receipts in the UK. To qualify, at least 85% of the budget had to be spent in the UK, and the vast majority of cast and crew had to be British. With this in mind, Universal's television head of production, George Santoro, hired London-based Ian Lewis to be the associate producer. As I mentioned earlier, Lewis had worked for Hammer Films for many years. When Stromberg found out about this, he was concerned because he didn't want his Frankenstein production to turn out looking like another Hammer film. He told Santoro, "Our Frankenstein must have the look and feel of a big-budget romantic epic, like Dr. Zhivago." Santoro reassured him that Lewis was the right man for the job. In fact, since leaving Hammer, Lewis had been production manager on bigger-budgeted Universal projects like Francois Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451. Nevertheless, when Lewis hired a production manager to be his right-hand man, he knew he needed someone with credentials that would pass the Stromberg litmus test. The person who fit the bill was Brian Burgess, who had recently production managed Frenzy for director Alfred Hitchcock. Stromberg knew Hitchcock very well, having worked closely with him on the Alfred Hitchcock Hour at CBS, and ever since becoming a producer on the Universal lot, Stromberg often had lunch with Hitchcock and regularly fed movie proposals to the director. All it took was one inter-office memo to Hitchcock for Stromberg to receive the thumbs-up he needed to bring Brian Burgess on board. In that same response, Hitchcock also recommended 5 other Frenzy crew members, all of whom were promptly hired. These included script supervisor Angela Martelli, who had also worked on Hitchcock's Stage Fright, as well as The Bridge on the River Kwai and You Only Live Twice, casting director Sally Nicole, whose credits included The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, Anne of a Thousand Days, and The Abominable Dr. Phibes, makeup artist Harry Frampton, renowned for his work on Kind Hearts and Coronets, Straw Dogs, The Last of Sheila, several Pink Panther films, as well as The House That Dripped Blood and I, Monster. Frampton would divvy up the workload with makeup artist Roy Ashton, who had 35-plus Hammer films to his credit, in addition to Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey and Billy Wilder's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Stromberg also hired the hairstylist from Frenzy, Patricia McDormand, whose credits included 2 Hammer films, The Devil Rides Out and Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and then later Raiders of the Lost Ark and the first 2 Star Wars films. The 6th and final of Hitchcock's recommendations was location manager Ian Goddard, who had been the assistant director on Witchfinder General with Vincent Price and later Mad Max. Additionally, many more A-list crew members were engaged for Frankenstein the True Story. These included director of photography Arthur Ibbotson, who had been Oscar-nominated for Anne of a Thousand Days. His other credits were Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, A Countess from Hong Kong, and the Hammer film Die, Die, My Darling. The costume supervisor was Elsa Fennell, whose credits included Lolita, Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, and The Abominable Dr. Phibes. The first assistant director was John Stoneman of Casino Royale, Sympathy for the Devil, and the Hammer film When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. Second assistant director Peter Cotton of Jabberwocky and Saturn III, and third assistant director Terry Pierce of Tales from the Crypt, Quest for Fire, and Willow. The special effects team employed several veterans of 2001: A Space Odyssey, including Oscar winner Colin Chilvers and Roy Wybrow. We now come to the big moment we've all been waiting for when Dr. Frankenstein brings his creature to life. Initially, the writer, Christopher Isherwood, had reservations about taking on the project. In his diary, he confessed, "When people say Frankenstein is a classic, they really mean only that the makeup is a classic as long as Boris Karloff wears it. The Universal people will surely realize that Frankenstein is now hopelessly old hat." Despite his misgivings, Isherwood agonized over how to resuscitate Frankenstein for a new generation, until finally he was thunderstruck with inspiration. "The creature must be beautiful," Isherwood declared, recalling the moment of his epiphany in a 1975 interview for Radio Times. "Mary Shelley certainly made an error in making the creature hideous from the very start. In our version of Frankenstein, the creature is first created as being of great beauty, truly a second Adam. He is perfect. Frankenstein even takes his creation to the opera. Everyone admires him. But gradually, inexplicably, his body deteriorates. It's a tragedy, there's no question. Great poignancy with Faustian overtones." Exhilarated by this fresh angle on the material, Isherwood agreed to give it a go. In the meantime, the producer, Stromberg, got busy trying to attract a star to play the role. Albert Finney, Richard Chamberlain, and Warren Beatty turned it down. Then in January 1973, Tom Baker's name came up as a possible creature. At that time, Baker was still 1 year away from taking over the lead in Doctor Who, so was then known for portraying Rasputin in Nicholas and Alexandra, which had earned Baker 2 Golden Globe nominations for Best Supporting Actor and Most Promising Male Newcomer. Stromberg rang up Baker and explained, "Christopher Isherwood has written the script, Tom, and we'd like to think about you for the part of the monster." In his autobiography, Baker wrote, "I was bowled over at the prospect. 'And who is going to direct it?' I asked, as if that mattered to me, who was out of work. So they said, 'Jack Smite,' and I said, 'Ah,' as if that meant something to me." Stromberg met with Baker and gave him a copy of the script. "I've never really had the chance to play monsters," Baker told him, dryly adding, "except, of course, in my private life." Stromberg liked his sense of humor. "I left the meeting," Baker recalled, "thinking about being a darling monster and how my performance might get me that Golden Globe Award." However, the writer, Isherwood, was dead set against it. He appreciated Baker's abilities as an actor, but the part of the creature had been written for someone younger and, well, frankly, better looking. Isherwood reminded Stromberg that when the creature first comes to life, Dr. Frankenstein takes one look at him and calls him beautiful, and that the relationship between them hinged on an undercurrent of homoerotic attraction. The sequence when the beautiful creature takes his first gasp of breath was conceived and directed with arresting sensitivity. The cinematography, the choice of angles, the editing, and the sparse, delicate music are pitch perfect. There had never been anything quite like this before. It was as though time stood still, and those of us who were watching it on TV in 1973 were absolutely riveted. In Cinefantastique magazine, critic Daniel Maslowski was so moved by it he waxed poetic. "This young Victor Frankenstein is not a mad doctor, he is us, and when he decides to join the brotherhood of Prometheus and defy the gods, we join and defy with him. And when man takes fire from heaven, we are excited and elated as we have never been watching other Frankenstein movies. The second Adam breathes his first breath. He looks down at us from high above. He comes down to us. We know now what the grandeur of man can be." but what is most important is that we feel. The role of the creature ultimately went to 32-year-old Michael Sarrazin. His brother Pierre told me, "People always said Michael had the most soulful eyes of any actor in Hollywood." Sarrazin had received wide acclaim for his breakthrough role as the marathon dancer opposite Jane Fonda in Sidney Pollack's They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, for which he had been nominated for a BAFTA award. The movie's success elevated Sarrazin to A-list status, and he was considered one of the industry's top young leading men. Born in Quebec, Sarrazin grew up in Montreal. He dropped out of high school to become an actor, gaining local fame in 1965 starring on Canadian television opposite Geneviève Bujold in Romeo and Jeanette. That same year, Universal Pictures signed him to a 7-year contract, prompting his relocation to Los Angeles. In a 1965 interview for the Montreal Gazette, Sarrazin seemed a bit trepidatious about the long-term commitment, saying, "Lots of actors and starlets go to Hollywood, get a contract, and are never heard from again. I expect I'll be put to work on The Hitchcock Show or even The Munsters." Oddly enough, both examples he randomly mentioned in jest happened to be shows that Stromberg had shepherded at CBS, and of course The Munsters was a distant relative of the Frankenstein movie he would eventually do for Universal. Initially, his worst fears came true. During the first 3 years of the deal, Universal assigned him small roles in only 4 TV shows, most notably Rod Serling's Doomsday Flight, a 1966 TV movie, and a forgettable part in his first theatrical film, Gunfight at Abilene, a routine western starring Bobby Darin. His first major role wasn't even for Universal. On loan out to 20th Century Fox, Sarrazin was cast opposite George C. Scott in Irvin Kershner's The Flim Flam Man, about a veteran con artist who takes on a young army deserter as his protege. Sarrazin got rave reviews, which woke up the folks at Universal, resulting in second-billed roles in 2 Universal westerns, A Man Called Gannon and Journey to Shiloh. 20th Century Fox borrowed Sarrazin again for The Sweet Ride, which earned him a Golden Globe nomination. Accordingly, Universal awarded Sarrazin his first top-billed lead in the thriller Eye of the Cat in 1968 from a script by Joseph Stefano of Psycho fame. Then Universal cast him opposite Julie Christie for In Search of Gregory. Next, director John Schlesinger screen-tested Sarrazin for the role of Joe Buck, the hustler, in United Artists' Midnight Cowboy, and decided to cast him opposite Dustin Hoffman. But once negotiations got serious for a loan-out agreement, Universal demanded too much money. Instead, Jon Voight got the part, and the movie went on to win Oscars for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Screenplay, not to mention Oscar nominations for Hoffman and Voight, who won a Golden Globe. Making amends for its egregious miscalculation, Universal decided to loan Sarrazin at a reasonable price for They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, in 1969, which finally solidified his place at the A-list table. Universal next assigned him major parts in Paul Newman's Sometimes a Great Notion and Lamont Johnson's The Ground Star Conspiracy, in which Sarrazin played a modern variant on Frankenstein's creature, disfigured and suffering from amnesia. It was Universal's George Santoro who recommended Sarrazin to play the creature. Santoro also knew that Sarrazin's 7-year contract with Universal was coming to an end in 1973, so if the studio planned to use the actor for anything else, it was now or never. When I was first offered the movie, Sarrazin recalled, I said, "Forget it, I didn't want to make a standard horror film." They sent him the material anyway and pointed out the name of the author. Sarrazin did a double take. "How often do you get a Christopher Isherwood script? I thought it was one of the best scripts I've read since I've been in Hollywood, and the most challenging part was the creature." Isherwood and his collaborator, Don Bacardi, took a very realistic approach, bordering on the plausible. There was nothing evil about the creature. He was somehow touching, a very interesting part, a complex kind of thing. Nevertheless, Sarrazin was apprehensive about what sort of makeup they had in mind for the creature. He explained, "The character created by Karloff, who was an excellent actor, was a mechanized monster complete with nuts, bolts, and encased in makeup. This was one of the facets that most concerned me, for in this version of the story, the creature is a young man with great expressiveness." Stromberg told a reporter, "Michael was scared to do it because he thought he would be in a rubber suit." Sarrazin recalled, "I was assured by producer Hunt Stromberg Jr. not to worry, that Harry Frampton, who had been signed to devise the makeup, was an expert. Among Harry's credits is Kind Hearts and Coronets, the film in which Alec Guinness had played 8 roles, including a Dowager Duchess." Frampton had more recently transformed Christopher Lee into a Mr. Hyde-like character for I, Monster, with appliances that resemble the ones he would create for Sarrazin. Stromberg added, "Once Michael understood the concept, he agreed." There was one awkward issue to clear up, however. Tom Baker was under the false impression he'd bagged the role of the creature. In his memoir, Baker recalled, "Then you guessed it. The phone rang. It was Hunt Stromberg, the producer. The studio wanted a name star for the monster, and also Christopher Isherwood would prefer somebody who was, well, handsome. There was nothing I could say to that, except as far as I knew, Dr. Frankenstein was not a plastic surgeon, and the monster had never been beautiful before." Hunt Stromberg is a prince of a man, and he was sympathetic, very sympathetic, to my point. But the studio was the studio, you know, so that was that. Nevertheless, Stromberg felt bad and promised to keep him in mind if anything else opened up. In an interview for the San Francisco Chronicle, Sarrazin recalled, "I went to England 5 weeks ahead of the company to work on the makeup with Harry Frampton." Leaving behind his home in Los Angeles, Sarrazin arrived in London the first week of February 1973. While in the UK for the next 5 months, Sarrazin was put up at the Blake's Hotel in South Kensington, a 5-star luxury hotel that later, in 1978, would be completely revamped by acclaimed interior designer Anushka Hempel, who also happened to have played a vampiress in the Hammer film Scars of Dracula. Co-writer Don Bacardi told me that they developed a mentor-like relationship between the Doctor and his creation, modeled after Pygmalion, the George Bernard Shaw play, which was the basis for the musical My Fair Lady. In the play, language professor Henry Higgins boasts that he can train a low-class Cockney flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, to pass for a duchess at a high society party, but while teaching the girl, he falls in love with her. The concept of Dr. Frankenstein training the creature to pass for a high society gentleman had never been done before, and the suggestion that an attraction grows between the Doctor and his muse would indeed be daring, virgin territory. These scenes are among the most suggestive of the gay subtext that was being purposefully layered into the story. After Stromberg failed to get Elsa Lanchester into the movie as a tribute to Bride of Frankenstein, he decided to offer a guest role to Valerie Hobson, who had played Elizabeth Frankenstein in the 1935 classic. Stromberg wanted Hobson to portray Dowager Countess Françoise Duval, the flirtatious French lady who encounters Dr. Frankenstein and his beautiful creature during intermission on their date night at the opera. But ever since Hobson's husband, John Perfumo, Britain's Secretary of State, had been caught having an affair and forced to resign, she had retired from public life, so the answer was no. French actress Simone Signoret also turned it down. Next, Stromberg offered the role to Tony Award winner and 3-time Oscar nominee Angela Lansbury, whom he had known since 1950 when he and Lansbury's husband, Peter Shaw, partnered to form a literary agency in Hollywood. As luck would have it, Lansbury happened to be in London rehearsing the stage musical Gypsy. Lansbury told me, "Everybody knew Hunt Stromberg Jr., and they certainly knew his dad. He was a great friend of ours, and it was through Hunt that my twin brothers, Bruce and Edgar, got executive jobs at ABC and CBS." When asked about being offered a role in Frankenstein the True Story, Lansbury lamented, "I would love to have worked with Hunt, but I was so involved with what I was doing in Gypsy, I couldn't think about anything else."
Beautiful.
Meanwhile, for the scene at the Opera House, they built the box seat as a small set in Pinewood Studios. The wide shots of the auditorium are borrowed footage from Universal's 1943 version of The Phantom of the Opera starring Claude Rains. And yes, that's the movie's co-star, Susanna Foster, taking a bow on stage. During intermission, the lobby was cheated around a staircase in Heatherton Hall, one of the administration buildings at Pinewood Studios. The role of the French Countess was finally taken by the distinguished British thespian Margaret Leighton, winner of 2 Tonys, an Emmy, and a BAFTA, plus an Oscar nomination. She also happened to be the real-life wife of Michael Wilding, the actor playing the father of Elizabeth. In 1974, I visited Leighton on the set of Great Expectations, in which she was playing Miss Havisham, and I asked her how she got the part in Frankenstein the True Story. She said, "My husband was in it. A lot of friends of mine were in it. A bunch of us were having dinner together, and the producer said, 'Why don't you come and play something in it?' And I said, 'Yes, I certainly will.' I really did not think they were serious when they asked me to do it, but they were serious, and I rather enjoyed it. It was great fun." To sweeten the deal, Stromberg promised to expand her role. Leighton told me, "The scene at the opera was in the original script. It was a small but important role, fundamental to the development of the story. The producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., came to me and told me that the film would be shown on television in America in 2 parts. He said that he would hate to see me only in part 1 of the film. He wanted to put me in both parts so the audience could see me both nights. So they added in my favorite part at the ball when I came dressed up as Little Bo Peep. I liked the Little Bo Peep bit the best. That was very funny." Third Assistant Director Terry Pierce told me, "We used 54 extras employed as atmosphere that day. At the top of those stairs were the offices of producer Peter Rogers and director Gerald Thomas, the team that made all the Carry On pictures." During my research of the late Christopher Isherwood's papers, archived at the Huntington Museum, I discovered an unpublished introduction that was intended to be included with the teleplay that was published in 1973 by Avon Books. Unfortunately, it missed the deadline and had laid dormant in a file unread until I arranged for its publication in the 2017 issue of Little Shop of Horrors magazine. In it, Isherwood and Bacardi write about the unusually close relationship of Dr. Frankenstein and his creature. "It was here that we departed from the original Frankenstein story. Our Dr. Frankenstein is making his creature to be the second Adam, a being who will be physically and spiritually superior to ordinary humans. Addressing it, he says, 'You who know nothing of greed or hatred, you will show us how to live. Wherever you go, you will bring happiness.' So now it seemed to us necessary that the creature should start its life beautiful, good-natured, and intelligent, not appear immediately as a hideous freak which scares everybody, as it does in almost every other version of the story, including Mary Shelley's original. According to our version, the process by which the creature is made is apparently successful. Only the audience knows that Frankenstein's method is at fault, and that the creature is doomed to deteriorate. This situation is not only more dramatic, it allows time for a stronger, more human relationship to develop between the Frankenstein and the creature."
After this evening's success, it seems foolish to delay public announcement. I will show him to all of London as soon as preparations are made. You do enough sleeping for 2 people.
Winner of 7 Academy Awards, makeup artist extraordinaire Rick Baker watched the premiere of Frankenstein the True Story in 1973 at the age of 22. The same year, he received his first screen credit as makeup artist on John Landis's Schlock. In 2018, Baker told me, "Frankenstein the True Story made a huge impression on me. There were so many memorable moments, but the one that intrigued me the most was the crawling arm. When Dr. Frankenstein poured acid on that arm and it disintegrated right before our eyes, I thought, how the hell did they do that? I was mesmerized." Well, the answer to Baker's question comes directly from the creator of this effect, Oscar winner Colin Chilvers, who told me, "We started with a plastic skeleton and added fake blood vessels and muscles. Then we made the exterior skin out of styrofoam because it quickly melts when you pour acetone onto it. And that's how it was done. Later, in part 2, you will see the technique used again for the iron mallet that Polidori's Chinese servant dissolves in acid. It was simply a mallet made of styrofoam and then dipped in acetone. Chilvers explained how the special effects department worked. At that time, I was working as a special effects assistant to Roy Wybrow. Roy would go out and get the movie contracts, then myself and the rest of the crew would be the ones that would actually do the practical aspect of it. I was the floor supervisor working closely with the director. After Frankenstein, the True Story, in 1974, I went on my own as a special effects supervisor starting with the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Chilvers' other credits include the first 3 Superman movies, Bride of Chucky, X-Men, and he even directed Michael Jackson's music video, Smooth Criminal. Here's an example of swans that were being wrangled by Stromberg's lover, Jacques Shelton. Back in America, they not only shared a lavish home in West Hollywood on Herald Way, next door to Liberace, complete with peacocks roaming the lawn, they also maintained the Double S Stromberg and Shelton Ranch in Texas, where they raised exotic birds, a woolly monkey, and a Bengal tiger, as one does. James Mason was the highest paid actor in the movie, earning $300,000. When shooting on locations away from Pinewood Studios, he would be provided with a luxurious 20-foot dressing room trailer. Throughout the production, he and his wife, Clarissa Kay, were given $1,500 a week for living expenses, out of which they would pay for their own accommodations. Instead of a fancy hotel in the hubbub of London, the Masons opted to rent a bucolic country home near Pinewood Studios. Built in 1690, the historic residence was the White Cottage in Denham Village, Buckinghamshire. This same village was the location for several sequences in the movie. Clarissa Kay recalled, "We didn't realize we would become, with the signing of our lease, foster parents to at least 500 birds." Being an authority on the subject, Stromberg's partner, Jacques Shelton, came over often to share his knowledge, resulting in the Masons developing a lasting passion for winged creatures. In fact, the following year, when Mason was in Louisiana shooting Mandingo, he and his wife visited Stromberg and Shelton at their Double S Ranch in Texas to see for themselves the menagerie of birds and other wildlife. The little girl who comes over to visit was played by Pierre Mason, no relation to James, a 6-year-old student from the Corona Stage School who later appeared in Savage Messiah, The Mirror Cracked, and Pink Floyd The Wall. In 2016, she told me, "I was accompanied to the set by a chaperone from Corona. For her one day of shooting, she earned £10 British sterling minus 25% commission from the school." The location for this scene was Pinewood Garden on the grounds of the studio, where there is a balustraded bridge that spans a lake. Stromberg treated his friend Agnes Moorehead like a queen during her stay in London, and she loved his wicked sense of humor. Whenever her chauffeured car came to pick her up, Stromberg would always say, "Darling, your broom has arrived." It was a nod to Bewitched, of course, but also a playful dig that she was a real-life witch. It never failed to crack her up. Sadly, it turned out to be one of Moorehead's final roles. Later that year, she would portray Aunt Alicia in the Broadway revival of Gigi, which opened on November 13, 1973, 2 weeks before Frankenstein, the True Story was broadcast. Shortly after that, Moorehead became ill and had to be replaced by Arlene Francis. Diagnosed with uterine cancer, she passed away April 30, 1974. Curiously, Moorehead was among the unusually high number of cast and crew members from the 1956 movie The Conqueror who died of cancer, including John Wayne, Susan Hayward, and Dick Powell. Dr. Robert Pendleton, professor of biology at the University of Utah, and other investigators have concluded that the epidemic outbreak of cancer cases was likely due to radiation exposure while filming in the Utah desert, downwind from a nearby Nevada nuclear testing site. During pre-production, auditions were held inside the headquarters of Universal Pictures Limited at 139 Piccadilly, the building that had once been the grand mansion of none other than, I kid you not, Lord Byron. The associate producer, Ian Lewis, recalled, "I was the one who told Hunt about 139 Piccadilly being the home of Lord Byron. I knew about it because the Frankenstein Mary Shelley Society used to come to our office and tour the place." For Stromberg, this was no coincidence. The place was practically sacred, and he bragged to everyone who came for a meeting that the spirit of Lord Byron was watching over them. Okay, so the blaring rock and roll tunes emanating from the nearby Hard Rock Cafe may have detracted from the historic mystique Stromberg was trying to cultivate, but let's not burst his bubble. Once production got underway at Pinewood Studios, a base of operation was formed there. Stromberg's secretary, Phyllis Alari, recalled, "In the center of Pinewood is H Stage, where some of the sets would be constructed, including the cellar underneath Frankenstein's laboratory. The building also housed our production offices, a section known as H Block. It was on the ground level and had a long hallway with several offices, one after the other. First there was Hunt's office, then mine, then the main production office, which housed production manager Brian Burgess, production secretary Vicki Deason, and the production runner Stephen Ridgewell. Next to them was the accounts office headed by Maurice Landsberger, followed by an office for the assistant directors. Further down was the art department where Wilford Shingleton and his staff were based." Asked where the special effects department was located, modeler Brian Smithies recalled, "In an old wooden shed just in front of where the current Bond stage is. We were always put out in sheds, as far away as possible from anything that mattered. I think they were worried that something would catch fire or blow up, but we never had any accidents." The wardrobe department was based in the main building on the lot devoted to costuming, and the editing suite, equipped with upright 35mm moviolas, was located in the cutting room block near the main entrance of the studio. Speaking of which, there's an interesting story as to how the renowned editor Richard Martin got hired. A few months earlier, when director John Schlesinger was offered the film, his schedule was simply too busy directing a stage show called I and Albert, a musical about Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and beyond that, prepping his next film, The Day of the Locust. Even so, Schlesinger eagerly read the script, and in an October 1972 letter to Stromberg wrote, "The writing is terrific. I wish you the best with it. Though I am regrettably unavailable to direct, I would highly recommend Dickie Marden to edit the film. He is an Oxford chum of mine who has become, in my humble opinion, one of the best in the business." Richard Dickie Marden had been Schlesinger's editor on one of the great milestones of queer cinema, Sunday Bloody Sunday, for which Marden had won the BAFTA Award for Best Editing. There is a kiss in that film between Daniel, Peter Finch, and Bob, Murray Head, that caused quite a commotion in its day. Even before that landmark, Marden had already dealt with frank gay subject matter when he edited Stanley Donen's Staircase, starring Richard Burton and Rex Harrison as longtime lovers. His resume also included such impressive titles as Two for the Road, Bedazzled, Anne of a Thousand Days, and Mary, Queen of Scots. At Schlesinger's behest, Stromberg got in touch with Marden, who was, at that time, busy editing Joseph L. Mankiewicz's Sleuth, based on the whodunit by Anthony Schaefer, starring Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine, to be released in December 1972. It went on to earn 4 Oscar nominations. Marden read the script and immediately agreed to edit Frankenstein the True Story as his next project. Richard Martin was a funny character, recalled Alex Smite, son of director Jack Smite, who came to set every day after school. His editing room was an explosion of film clips. He had stuff all over the place. He was one of those guys who would reach into a pile and pull out the exact frame he wanted. I remember thinking, how did you know that's in there? Along with Stromberg and Shelton, Isherwood and Bacardi, Agnes Moorehead, and several others, Marden was another co-conspirator among the movie's burgeoning gay mafia, or as Stromberg called themselves, the Lavender Hill Mob. Everyone knew Dickie was gay, Stromberg's secretary Phyllis Alari confirmed. He was a charming man, absolutely one of the loveliest people. He was a bit old school, always nattily dressed, always wore a jacket and tie, and he had a fantastic sense of humor. Hunt was terribly camp, so between the two of them, there was a lot of laughter. If Stromberg had any concerns that his straight director might not instinctively identify with the nuances of the gay subtext in Frankenstein the True Story, the hiring of Marden to edit the film was an effective insurance policy. Subsequently, Marden would be sought to collaborate with such iconic gay directors as George Cukor on The Corn is Green, Franco Zeffirelli on Hamlet, Sparrow, and Jane Eyre, and Clive Barker on Hellraiser and Nightbreed, while continuing his alliance with Schlesinger on The Falcon and the Snowman and The Innocent. Given that the above-the-line VIPs included a sizable number of LGBTQ folk, one might assume that the below-the-line rank and file of the crew would be just as diverse. Not necessarily. Additional third assistant director Michael Farey confided, "I think I was the only gay person on the entire shooting crew. It was my first job right out of school. I was there to get a union ticket. I had no idea if being gay in this industry would be a problem or not. So, naturally, I was fascinated that the producer and his partner were so open about being a couple. It made a huge impression on me and gave me a great deal of courage and pride. Even so, I was very discreet and careful about my sexuality at the time. It was a macho industry." After the movie, Farey went on to work as a sound camera operator on 3 Ken Russell movies, Mahler, Tommy, and Listomania. Subsequently, he joined Thames Television as a film cameraman for international news and documentaries, including the controversial This Week Death on the Rock about the 1988 deaths of 3 IRA members in Gibraltar that rocked the Thatcher government.
Figaro! Figaro?
Reverend, may I speak with you?
The parish church of St. Mary the Virgin in Hedgerley, Buckinghamshire, was the location used for this confession scene between Frankenstein and a priest played by Peter Sallis, widely beloved as the voice of Wallace in the Wallace and Gromit movies. His 150-plus credits include The Curse of the Werewolf, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scream and Scream Again, and Robert Fust's Wuthering Heights. There were 76 days of shooting from March 15 through July 2, 1973, plus 1 extra day on August 25th for the James Mason introduction. The daily routine during the shoot was 5 days per week, with 3 paid holiday breaks for Good Friday, Easter Monday, and Spring Bank Holiday Monday. When shooting took place at Pinewood Studios, the typical workday lasted 8 hours, plus 1 hour break for lunch. The call time was usually 8:30 a.m., lunch was from 1 to 2 p.m., and wrap was at 5:30 p.m. There were 2 15-minute tea and biscuit breaks at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. Dailies were screened at 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. in Theater 1. When location shoots were nearby, the cast and crew would report to Pinewood at 7 a.m. and be driven in cars and vans to the location by 8 a.m. and return to the studio by 6 p.m. Special arrangements were made for Beachy Head, the one distant overnight location. The only sequence shot at night was the burning of Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory on a slightly later split call from 9:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. All other exterior nighttime sequences were shot day for night. No shooting was done on weekends, with the exception of Saturday, June 2nd, when the box seat set and opera lobby staircase were shot, to make up for the prior Monday spring bank holiday, so it still amounted to a 5-day work week. Studio chauffeurs were assigned to pick up and return the producer, director, and main cast members according to their individual call and wrap times. Dressing rooms were assigned to each cast member inside various studio buildings. Originally in the script, when the creature returns to the opera house by himself to see the Marriage of Figaro again, he encounters 3 thugs who taunt him in a dark alley behind the theater, hoping to rob what appears to be a vulnerable, well-dressed gentleman. The leader of the gang breaks a bottle over the creature's head without any discernible effect. Then, when the creature steps into the light, revealing his gnarly face, the thugs get spooked and run away. Afterwards, Dr. Frankenstein finds the creature there and takes him home. Stromberg tried to convince music superstar Neil Diamond to do a guest cameo appearance as the leader of this gang, but he turned it down. Instead, Stromberg cast gay actor David Boyce, the former drummer for the Roadrunners, the 1960s Liverpool rhythm and blues band, which famously played the Cavern Club in 1963 with the Beatles. The original plan was to shoot the sequence in central London outside the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, while also filming establishing shots of this historic building's facade with period carriages and extras. However, by the time they got around to shooting these bits toward the end of the shoot, the movie was running over schedule and over budget, so the establishing shots were omitted, and the thug scene was economically cheated in an existing alley on the backlot of Pinewood. Sadly, the attempted mugging never made the final edit of the film, left on the cutting room floor. However, we do get a glimpse of that alley when Dr. Frankenstein locates the creature and leads him away. When the 1931 Frankenstein was being made, Boris Karloff and director James Whale shared the opinion that abandonment was central to the tragedy. In Dennis Gifford's Karloff, the Man, the Monster, the Movies, Karloff himself is quoted as follows: "The most heartrending aspect of the creature's life for us was his ultimate desertion by his creator." The same theme was embraced by the writers of Frankenstein the True Story. Isherwood noted, "When the creature does begin to deteriorate, it is Frankenstein who behaves the worse of the two. The creature, even when it has become dangerous to others, goes on trusting Frankenstein and feeling attachment to him. But Frankenstein can't overcome the disgust and shame which the creature now causes him. At last he has a chance to get rid of the creature altogether. He would like to, but he can't quite bring himself to do the deed. Later, Polidori says to him contemptuously, 'It pleased you as long as it was pretty. Then you wanted to be rid of it. But somebody else had to do it for you. So much for your dainty conscience.' Bacardi told me they intended this to be a biting indictment of the youth and beauty-obsessed culture that is so pervasive in the gay community. The creature searches for a piece of broken mirror in order to see a reflection of his condition. When he discovers that his skin is deteriorating and becoming ugly, he cries out, "Victor!" No. In the film, Dr. Frankenstein says nothing. He just stares at the creature, disgusted by his rotting condition. In an early 1971 draft, however, Frankenstein disingenuously tries to console the creature by saying, "I will never desert you. You must trust me. We will be together always." But the creature senses that Dr. Frankenstein is lying and no longer wants him. The pathos that Sarrazin generates in this scene is genuinely heartbreaking. It brought me to tears when I first saw it, and it never fails to pack a wallop on repeated viewings. When the rejected creature stabs himself in the heart, the color of the fluid that emerges from the creature's chest wound is not the usual blood red. The fluid is a pale tint of purple. In several early drafts of the script, the description states that purple fluid oozes from the wounds. Of course, the color purple is commonly used symbolically to represent the LGBTQ community. At the halfway point in the original script, The creature tries to commit suicide by walking into a river with rushing rapids that wash him downstream. Stromberg nixed that entirely and came up with a far more visually stunning idea. The creature should hurl himself off the white cliffs of Dover, he demanded. Many people, Stromberg included, have identified the cliff that was used as being the White Cliffs of Dover. Actually, that's not true. The location that ended up being used instead was in fact Beachy Head, another equally stunning chalky bluff in Eastbourne, Sussex. The scene was gut-wrenching, played almost entirely without dialogue. Colin Chilvers recalled, "We built 4 identical dummies for multiple takes. The skeleton was made out of steel, the arms would only bend like human arms, the weight was roughly the same as Saracen, and each dummy was dropped by helicopter near the cliff." Gaff squad alert! In the final helicopter shot, when Frankenstein is walking away from the cliff, a white car can be briefly spotted scooting between 2 hills in the distance at the top center area of the screen, just before the image dissolves into the next sequence. There, did you see it? The 2-day shoot, June 26 through 27, 1973, was the movie's only distant overnight location, 124 miles from Pinewood Studios. As a result, a slightly reduced cast and crew of 50 people were transported by chauffeured cars, vans, and buses and put up for one night at the Grand Hotel in Eastbourne. Other films that have used Beachy Head as a location include Battle of Britain, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Quadrophenia, The Living Daylights, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and Atonement. This concluded Part 1 of Frankenstein, the True Story. Immediately afterward, NBC showed previews for Part 2, narrated by James Mason, featuring a whole new array of characters, exotic settings, explosions, fires, everything to ensure that viewers would return the following night. As if there was not enough star power in the film already, while they were still shooting, Stromberg called up actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr., whom he knew was a friend of Queen Elizabeth, and asked him to extend an invitation to her to appear in a special introduction for Frankenstein the True Story. After all, Mary Shelley and her novel were 2 of England's proudest national treasures. Nevertheless, the Queen respectfully declined. Stromberg's colleagues joked that he was crazy to think the Queen would ever actually endorse a movie. And yet, 39 years later, she was persuaded to film a sketch for the 2012 Olympics, directed by Danny Boyle, featuring Daniel Craig as James Bond, as a cross-promotion for Skyfall. Universal, NBC, and Stromberg agreed to the highly unusual move of publishing the Isherwood-Bacardi script in its entirety. Universal struck a deal with Avon Books to release a paperback edition of the Frankenstein the True Story teleplay to hit bookstore shelves the week of the film's premiere. Co-writer Don Bacardi recalled, "We were delighted when we learned that our script would be published, until we realized that it was going to be the shooting draft, which had been altered by Hunt Stromberg. I immediately got on a plane, flew to New York, and literally stormed the offices of Avon Books. I told them that Chris and I would take our names off the publication if they went ahead with the shooting draft. I gave them the draft that Chris and I approved, and lo and behold, that's what they ended up publishing, thank heavens." Because the teleplay was owned by Universal, Isherwood and Bacardi were not entitled to any royalties from the sale of the book. Hollywood super agent Irvin Swifty Lazar, who had just become Isherwood's new agent, felt differently. Isherwood reported in his diary, "Swifty has called Universal, and they have agreed in principle that Don and I should get some money from the sales of the paperback." The week of the premiere broadcast, TV Guide published a breathtaking 5-page spread with 12 color photos. Michael Sarrazin made the cover of The Advocate, the national gay publication, with the cheeky headline, "At last, a monster we'd like to get stuck on a desert island with." Part 2 of Frankenstein the True Story was shown on NBC the following night, Saturday, December 1st, 1973. It began with the Universal logo. A recap of Part 1, narrated by Leonard Whiting, featured over 3.5 minutes of highlights as a refresher for the initiated and a crash course to whet the appetites of newbies who were tuning in for the first time. And there were a lot of virgin eyeballs to bring up to speed. Ratings-wise, Frankenstein the True Story, Part 1, was the most-watched program of that night, nationwide, ranking number 27 for the week on the Nielsen's ratings chart, with 13.3 million viewers watching live on NBC. Back then, there were no video recorders or DVRs to program for later viewing. If you wanted to see a show, you had to make an appointment to be in front of your TV screen, and there was no pausing for bathroom breaks, phone calls, or runs to the kitchen for snacks. There were only 3 major networks competing for viewership: NBC, CBS, and ABC. On that Friday night, CBS counter-programmed Richard Brooks' acclaimed true crime thriller In Cold Blood that had previously been released theatrically, and ABC ran its popular Friday night comedy lineup, including Room 222, Adam's Rib, and Love American Style. Goosed by positive word of mouth, Part 2 did even better on Saturday night, ranking number 15 for the week with 14.6 million viewers, competing against CBS's usually unbeatable triple threat of The Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Bob Newhart Show, and The Carol Burnett Show, and on ABC, a college football game. This was an unexpected increase of 1.3 million viewers above the Friday night crowd. Universal and NBC were absolutely thrilled by the result. A few nights before the broadcasts, a swanky premiere screening and dinner party was hosted on the lot of Universal City. Nancy Anderson, West Coast editor of Photoplay magazine, reported, "Jacqueline Bisset is so proud of Michael Sarrazin's performance in Frankenstein the True Story, she was beaming at him throughout the invitational screening." Back together, Sarrazin and Bisset had managed to weather the storm of her short-lived affair with John Peters, but the reconciliation didn't last. In 1974, the two would part ways once and for all. Denise Millay, wife of the movie's composer Gil Millay, was there that evening and vividly recalled, "Gil and I couldn't believe our eyes when Hunt Stromberg and his partner Jacques Shelton walked in with none other than Mae West. This was a few years after Myra Breckenridge, so she was no spring chicken, but she was dressed head to toe in glitter and glam and made quite an entrance, let me tell you." Holding court, Stromberg explained to the throngs of agog onlookers, "Mae and I go way back. She used to bounce me in her lap when I was a little boy." With one hand on her swiveling hip and the other plumping her bouffant, Mae deadpanned, "He wasn't so little." San Francisco Examiner columnist Dwight Newton simply could not contain his enthusiasm for the film, leaking the following first review. "I can tell you that the audience was left limp. Horror fans take note. What happens to Frankenstein's exquisite female creation is, to put it mildly, electrifying. The creature is played by Michael Sarrazin, and he'll be the talk of television when Frankenstein is broadcast." After the recap, the opening card Frankenstein the True Story added the words Part 2. This was followed by a repeat of the shot of the creature washed ashore, his suicide attempt a dismal failure. He pulls himself up, considers his options, and decides he has little choice but to go on living. Perhaps he will be able to find acceptance somewhere else, and thus begins his journey to find love. In the original script, the creature first stumbles upon a gypsy encampment with a caravan of carts and horses, with families cooking around an open fire. Hungry, the creature comes forward to ask for food, but the gypsies are afraid of him and lock themselves in the carts. While they watch in horror, he picks up the scalding pot of stew and drinks from it with no reaction to the burning heat. The scene was scheduled to be shot at Black Park, but was canceled and never filmed due to budgetary and running time trims. So, the first person the creature runs into is Lacey, the blind fiddler. Stromberg cast none other than the great British thespian Sir Ralph Richardson. The character was loosely based on de Lacy from Shelley's novel, but more closely follows the interpretation of the character as played by O.P. Hedgie in Bride of Frankenstein. Gene Hackman would soon have a field day spoofing the character in Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein, which began shooting just 2.5 months after Frankenstein the True Story was broadcast. Sir Ralph Richardson, who was 70 years old at the time, had been nominated for 3 Tony Awards for his work on Broadway. In movies, he had been Oscar nominated for The Heiress, and later, in 1985, he would be posthumously Oscar nominated again for Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes. He won Best Actor at the Cannes Film Festival for Long Day's Journey into Night, and a BAFTA Award for The Sound Barrier. His very first movie was the 1933 horror film The Ghoul, starring Boris Karloff and Ernest Thesiger. Other genre credits included Things to Come, Whoever Slew Auntie Roo, and Tales from the Crypt, in which he played the Crypt Keeper. Regarding Frankenstein the True Story, Richardson said, "It is a remarkably good script, but only what one would expect from Isherwood." The actor had a very specific look in mind for the character and took it upon himself to draw a sketch with detailed notations. He sent this to Stromberg for approval and ended up looking exactly like the drawing in the final film. The illustration was found among Stromberg's papers archived at the University of Southern California's Cinematic Arts Library, and if you would like to see it, I arranged to have it published for the first time ever in Little Shop of Horrors magazine number 38, the issue devoted to this movie. Richardson's scenes were filmed over the course of 4 days, May 29th to June 1st, 1973. The interiors of Lacey's farmhouse were shot on a set built at Pinewood Studios' F Stage. The exteriors were shot in a forest where they constructed the farmhouse from scratch. Associate producer Ian Lewis told me, "We built that in Burnham Beaches, which is about 6 miles away from Pinewood Studios." But Ralph Richardson still managed to get lost trying to find it on his motorcycle. "Motorcycle?" I replied in disbelief. "Sir Ralph Richardson drove himself to work on a motorcycle?" "Yes," Lewis confirmed, "always. We didn't want him to do it, but he insisted. It worried us because in Burnham Beaches, it is incredibly easy to get lost. He said, 'I know where I'm going, don't worry.' But then, of course, he turned up late because he got lost. He was a great one for doing things like that. He also couldn't remember his lines. He never did, on any picture. We all knew that. We had to make cue cards." As luck would have it, the latest James Bond movie, Live and Let Die, Roger Moore's first round as 007, was shooting at Pinewood Studios throughout pre-production of Frankenstein the True Story. Around the Pinewood lot, Hunt Stromberg had spotted an extraordinarily captivating Bond girl whom he thought would be perfect for the dual role of Agatha, granddaughter of Lacey, and Prima, the female creature. Production manager Brian Burgess told me, "Our producer, Hunt Stromberg, wanted to meet her, so I went into the Pinewood restaurant and went up to Harry Saltzman, the producer of the Bond pictures. I introduced myself and said, 'We'd like to meet the actress in your movie.' 'No!' Saltzman barked like a rabid dog. 'She's our star. You can't come anywhere near her.'" Burgess reported to Stromberg that his overture had been summarily brushed off. Of course, that just made the actress all the more intriguing. Then one day in late February 1973, Stromberg was eating lunch at the Pinewood restaurant at a table with his partner Jacques Shelton, director Jack Smite, and associate producer Ian Lewis. He kept looking across the room where several Live and Let Die teammates were clustered without their guard dog producer. Stromberg turned to his comrades and said, "Excuse me a moment, I'll be right back." He walked straight over to the 007 table and reintroduced himself to Roger Moore, they'd met socially on previous occasions, and explained that he was currently producing a major new Frankenstein movie at Pinewood. "The script is written by Christopher Isherwood," Stromberg name-dropped, trying to impress the table. "Oh, yes," Moore replied with a sly grin. "He wrote a picture I did at MGM called Diane. It bombed so badly the studio dropped me. I hope you'll have better luck with this one." "Well, we have better actors, so that's a start," Stromberg dryly retorted, getting a rise from the table, Moore included. And while we're on that subject, I wonder if you would do me the honor of introducing me to your enchanting co-star." "Why, of course, my good fellow," Moore said, turning to the ravishing 22-year-old actress seated beside him with hair down to her waist. "This is Jane Seymour, and mark my words, she's going to be a major star." Seymour smiled and said, "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Stromberg." "The pleasure is all mine," Stromberg replied. "I understand that your picture wraps just before my picture starts, which is extremely fortuitous, don't you think?" "Why's that?" the actress asked. "Because, Miss Seymour, you're going to be in my picture," Stromberg announced with utter confidence. Seymour laughed. "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious," Stromberg replied. "I want you to play not one but two parts. An innocent farm girl named Agatha who dies in an accident and is brought back to life as an evil female creature named Prima." Not sure what to make of this peculiar man, Seymour politely said, "I look forward to reading the script." "That's not necessary," he replied. "I want your commitment here and now before I return to my table for dessert." Taken aback, Seymour asked, "Have you ever seen me act?" "Roger thinks you're going to be a major star," Stromberg said. "That's all I need to know. And did I mention your co-stars will be James Mason, Michael Sarrazin, Leonard Whiting, and David McCallum?" Seymour's jaw dropped. "Well, then how can I say no?" "You can't," Stromberg replied. "I'll have my people talk to your people, and we'll see you at the read-through." With that, Stromberg turned on his heel and marched back to his table in a blaze of glory. The production manager, Brian Burgess, told me, "That's a glaring example of how Hunt refused to take no for an answer. He was very smooth at manipulating people to get what he wanted." Eventually, Seymour was given the opportunity to read the teleplay. "I loved the script immediately," she recalled, "but I must confess the idea of playing two entirely different characters was the main attraction." I asked Seymour about her scenes as Agatha, and she said, "Well, the thing I remember most is that my grandfather was played by Sir Ralph Richardson, which was very exciting, but also quite intimidating. I had gone and done my research of how someone would speak from that part of the world. When we began the scene, I spoke my lines with an accent so thick nobody understood a word I said. The response from Sir Ralph was, 'What did you say, my dear?' And I thought, oh gosh, here I am, an actress, I'm trained, I'm trying to do the correct accent, and I play this country girl authentically, and my grandfather is speaking royal English." And that wasn't her only embarrassing moment either. "On my first day," Seymour added, "I sat down in a chair and Sir Ralph walked around me 5 times. He just kept walking round and round, like a dog circling around its prey, and I kept thinking, why is he walking round and round? He's an old guy. Then suddenly I realized, oh my God, I'm in his chair. I literally leapt out like a rocket ship and I ran. I don't think I ever talked to him again. I was mortified. Oh my God, I've really screwed up now." The role of Felix, the strapping young farmhand, was played by Dallas Adams, a young gay actor who had become social friends with the producer Hunt Stromberg and his partner Jacques Shelton. As a result, he was a frequent presence on set even during the days when he was not working, a, shall we say, decorative addition to Stromberg's Lavender Hill mob. At the end of the movie, you will notice that he is given a special prominent credit introducing Dallas Adams, even though he had previously appeared in at least 7 television programs and movies, including The Abominable Dr. Phibes as second police official. Years later, in 1984, Adams gained notoriety among Doctor Who enthusiasts for portraying Professor Howard Foster in the 4-part Doctor Who Planet of Fire. According to Doctor Who producer John Nathan Turner, in the early 80s, Adams was the first man to win a gay palimony case in UK legal history. Tragically, Adams would succumb to AIDS in 1991 at age 44.
Goodbye, Mr. Lacey. Don't expect us back before sunset. I hope our friend was listening.
You did take Toby up, didn't you?
Aye.
You know what sharp ears grandfather has.
Getting back to the subject of Jane Seymour, there was another perk to the Frankenstein job that struck her fancy. Seymour told me I was particularly excited about meeting David McCallum because I was a huge Man from U.N.C.L.E. fan. I didn't have any scenes with him, but I got to meet him at the table read when all the actors were gathered before we started shooting to read through the script. I was sitting at a table across from him, and it was just more than I could bear. To be perfectly honest, I was more excited about meeting David McCallum on Frankenstein than meeting Roger Moore on Live and Let Die. At that time in my life, my three favorite idols were Roger Moore because of his TV series The Saint, David McCallum of Man from U.N.C.L.E., and of course Paul McCartney of the Beatles. So with Live and Let Die and Frankenstein the True Story, I managed to meet my fantasy trifecta. Seymour was born in Hillingdon, England in 1951. Her birth name was Joyce Penelope Wilhelmina Frankenberg. She was a prodigy ballet dancer who began training at 3 and at 13 made her debut with the London Festival Ballet. Then I did a jazz class, Seymour explained, and damaged the cartilage in my knees, which meant I could never do classical ballet. It was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because it led to becoming an actress. She also became disenchanted with her last name. Frankenberg sounded too much like Frankenstein, she recalled. At first, I shortened it to Joyce Frank, but then my agent suggested Jane Seymour, and I went with it. Little did she know that the Frankenstein name would come back to haunt her in the most exquisite way. In 1969, Seymour appeared in her first movie as a chorus girl in Richard Attenborough's Oh, What a Lovely War. Through this association, she met the director's son, Michael Attenborough, and they married in 1971. Richard Attenborough then cast his new daughter-in-law in his next picture, Young Winston, in the much larger role of Pamela Plowden, the first great love of Winston Churchill, played by Simon Ward. This exposure brought her to the attention of producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, who cast her as their latest Bond girl, Solitaire, in Live and Let Die.
Agatha. Beautiful Agatha. Rest.
The creature takes the dead body of Agatha back to his birthplace, Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory, with the hope that she can be resurrected the same way he was. But Dr. Frankenstein has not only abandoned his creature, he has abandoned his experiments and has never set foot in his lab again. To the creature's surprise, a squatter has moved in and spruced up the lab with wall-to-wall Chinese decor, including a giant fireplace bellows with golden dragon ornamentation. It's none other than the diabolical Dr. Polidori, played, of course, by James Mason. The producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., insisted that Dr. Polidori's decorating and fashion sense would rival the lush flamboyance of Dr. Fu Manchu, as exemplified by his father's 1932 production, The Mask of Fu Manchu, starring Boris Karloff. Accordingly, Polidori has surrounded himself in opium den chic and sports a smart black kimono robe, perhaps channeling Doctor Strange, the Marvel comic book character with injured hands, mystic powers of persuasion, and an Asian manservant. Polidori one-ups that with 2 attractive Asian houseboys to facilitate his every need, from chauffeuring to feeding, and anything else one might imagine. Polidori later tells Dr. Frankenstein, "The day after you left rather abruptly, I moved in. Being a confirmed traveler, I've learned to make myself at home wherever I go." Isherwood's pointed use of the phrase confirmed traveler was a sly play on words. The phrase confirmed bachelor is a polite euphemism for a gay man, and Polidori fit the bill on all counts. Polidori also tells Frankenstein that Dr. Clerval, the David McCallum character, had, quote, deserted him, suggesting that their former relationship was far more intimate than mere colleagues. The co-writer, Don Bacardi, confirmed to me that was exactly what they had intended, and that both Clerval and Polidori were indeed gay. Aside from the Fu Manchu influence, the main inspiration for the character of Dr. Polidori was, in fact, Dr. Pretorius, the mad scientist in Bride of Frankenstein, unique to that film, nowhere to be found in Shelley's book. A former teacher of Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Pretorius had become a mysterious outcast who dabbled in the black arts, growing miniature humanoids in petri jars, all part of a grand scheme for world domination. One dark and stormy night, Dr. Pretorius shows up unannounced and blackmails Dr. Frankenstein into making a female creature. With a macabre sense of humor, Dr. Pretorius also had an effeminate demeanor that left little to the imagination, portrayed so deliciously by the great British character actor Ernest Thesiger. In the movie, Frankenstein's housekeeper Minnie announces his arrival, describing him as a very queer-looking old gentleman. The insinuation was deliberate. In James Whale's A Biography, or The Would-Be Gentleman, author Mark Gatiss described Pretorius as a desiccated homosexual imp with waspish malevolence, who tempts Dr. Frankenstein away from all that is safe and natural. In The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror, author David J. Scull reported that Whale instructed Thesiger to play Pretorius as an over-the-top caricature of a bitchy and aging homosexual. That he did. And because of it, according to Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet, Dr. Pretorius is considered one of the earliest examples of a homosexual character in mainstream cinema. So, in 1971, at the very inception of this new Frankenstein project, Stromberg pledged his allegiance to Dr. Pretorius, demonstrating that he had no interest whatsoever in sticking to Shelley's book, despite what Universal and NBC may have otherwise believed. And in the early drafts of Isherwood and Bacardi's scripts for Frankenstein the True Story, the character was actually named Dr. Pretorius. Stromberg considered Dr. Pretorius to be the central component of his master plan, a juicy supervillain designed specifically to attract a big-league movie star. In a January 1971 memo to Sid Sheinberg, president of Universal Television, Stromberg confidently wrote, "It is my goal to induce none other than Richard Burton to play the role of the flamboyantly insane Dr. Pretorius." At that point in his illustrious career, Burton had been Oscar-nominated a whopping 6 times and had won a Golden Globe, a BAFTA, and a Tony Award. Furthermore, Stromberg wanted Burton's wife, 2-time Oscar winner Elizabeth Taylor, to play the dual role of Agatha and Prima. On August 18, 1971, the Burtons agreed to star in the film, if the studio would meet their demands. Their agent, Robin French, told me, "I remember when Liz and Dick were considering doing the picture for Universal, I had to go to MCA Universal chairman Lou Wasserman and explain that if he wanted them, they were each going to get $1 million, which in those days was top dollar. And I remember Wasserman saying to me, 'Nobody is worth that. Even Betty Davis, who was my client when she was in her prime, wasn't worth that. So sorry, no, I can't.'" Before finally landing James Mason for the role, Stromberg had offered the part to a slew of candidates, including Marlon Brando, Laurence Olivier, Burt Lancaster, Orson Welles, Anthony Quinn, Rex Harrison, Paul Scofield, Peter Ustinov, Oliver Reed, perhaps even Colonel Sanders for all we know. Stromberg and the writers eventually decided to change the name of Dr. Pretorius to Dr. Polidori, after Lord Byron's real-life physician, because they wanted to accentuate the castrating nickname that Dr. Clerval disdainfully calls him, Polly Dolly. And don't forget, the brain inside the creature's head is that of Dr. Clerval, though suffering from amnesia at the moment, but that will soon wear off, and much to his dismay, Dr. Polidori will find himself being addressed as Polly Dolly all over again. Stromberg and Mason had known each other socially for many years, but their friendship blossomed during the production. They loved to play practical jokes on one another, and Stromberg got things started in a big way. Instead of sending a welcoming fruit basket or flowers to Mason on day one, the producer mischievously stocked the actor's dressing room with a decorative conversation piece of the Charles Addams variety. Photoplay Film Monthly journalist Gordon Gow was one of the privileged few who got to experience the gag up close and personal. He wrote, "Although it was mid-morning and bright daylight shone through the windows of James Mason's dressing room, number 148 at Pinewood Studios, nevertheless, I experienced a spooky shiver the moment I entered the place. The first thing to command my eye was an inert and naked body laying on the floor against the wall. Mason himself was nonchalant about it. Interesting, isn't it? A life-size replica of Michael Sarrazin, you know. At second blink, I could see it was a dummy, but a very convincing one. Of course, this was one of the dummies that had been manufactured to drop from the cliff during the creature's suicide attempt. Mason thought it was the most hilarious gift he'd ever received, and derived immense pleasure from spooking visitors with it. The tongue-in-cheek one-upsmanship between Mason and Stromberg would thrive throughout the rest of their lives.
As an experience, I can show you where you went wrong. Come now, as a man of science, the prospect must tempt you. I can see that it does.
If you are misguided enough to go on with these researches, you must do so alone.
That is out of the question, alas. Oblige me by taking off my gloves.
In this scene, Dr. Polidori reveals to Dr. Frankenstein that his hands have been permanently destroyed from a chemical accident. One can only wonder if Dr. Clerval may have witnessed or perhaps even been responsible for the mishap. At the end of Polidori's right arm, there remained only an acid-scarred stump. We will later see, at the end of his left arm, there was a hideously shriveled and scarred hand. These were created by makeup artist Roy Ashton, who joked, "We might hold the record for the number of damaged limbs, diseased faces, and general oddities made for any one production." Some critics and fans have postulated that the idea may have come from the 1967 Hammer film Frankenstein Created Woman, in which Dr. Frankenstein's hands have been similarly disfigured from the fire at the climax of the previous film in that series, The Evil of Frankenstein. It is true that both doctors hide their mutilations underneath black gloves and create women. Well, I hate to throw cold water on this smoking gun, but Dr. Polidori more closely resembles supervillain Dr. Julius No in the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, from 1962, in which black gloves are worn over mechanical talons because the doctor's hands had been accidentally destroyed during radiation experiments. There are also parallels to Marvel Comics' Doctor Strange, a surgeon whose hands were crippled in a car accident, and the aforementioned Asian manservant he employs to help him. Confusing the issue further, there are many other black glove precedents, including 2 versions of The Hands of Orlac, Mystery of the Wax Museum, Mad Love, and House of Wax. There's even Lionel Atwill's Inspector Krogh with his prosthetic arm in Son of Frankenstein. And yet none of these appear to have been the main inspiration for the writers. In Isherwood's diary, he mentions that after he added the black glove mutilated hands idea to Polidori, he happened to see Monty Hellman's The Shooting, a 1967 Western in which Jack Nicholson wears black gloves to disguise disfigured hands. Despite all of this, Isherwood claims the idea originated from his own real-life affliction, Dupuytren's contracture, which was deforming and disabling his own left hand. Just as Polidori needed servants to help him, Isherwood relied on his partner, Don Bachardy, to take dictation and type up their manuscripts. Nevertheless, let's agree that the origin of this trope is so blurry, no one can really claim sole authorship.
Suppose I refuse.
Suppose I tell our friend to get out of the carriage, and then suppose I drive off, leaving you to explain him. Suppose we stop supposing and discuss our plans for the immediate future like sensible people.
On April 18, 1973, Daily Variety published a report from London about the shooting in progress. Refreshingly honest, Stromberg told the trade paper, "Anyone looking for the remake to be a gothic monster yarn can forget it. While the new edition retains the spirit and theme of the original novel, it's otherwise a total invention based on a romantic conception in which, for one thing, the man-made creature is a beauty and not horrific." The network had a completely different impression of what was being made. NBC VP of Programming Larry White issued the following statement on June 28, 1973. "Isherwood wanted to tell the Mary Shelley story just as she told it and has used most of her material." Clearly, White had never read the Shelley novel and seemed oblivious to the contradiction Stromberg had been telling reporters. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the makeup for Michael Sarrazin's deteriorating creature. It has often been misreported as the work of Roy Ashton, who did the makeup for the monster played by Kiwi Kingston in The Evil of Frankenstein. In an interview for Little Shop of Horrors magazine number 14, Ashton set the record straight. "I did Frankenstein the True Story for Universal Television, which was a lengthy film. I was there for 6 months. Harry Frampton made up Michael Sarrazin as the monster, while I took care of all the others, James Mason, David McCallum, Leonard Whiting, and Sir Ralph Richardson." Even so, Ashton was responsible for making a cast of Sarrazin's face to create a life-size plaster bust, which Frampton used as a model to develop the prosthetics that would be applied during the shoot. There were 6 stages of makeup, producer Hunt Stromberg Jr. explained. It was a terrifically precise and difficult thing to do. The creature had to look burned, and then the burns had to begin healing. We had to make sure the makeup never immobilized Sarrazin's face. By the time the 4th stage was reached, the task of applying his makeup took 5 hours to complete. Sarrazin told a reporter, "It was essential the creature would not look grotesque. The change had to be gradual. First, growths, like warts behind the ear, then a slight bulging of the forehead, a coarsening and thickening of the skin, the head growing slightly lopsided. I was in that makeup for 10 weeks of the 5 months we spent on the film, starving through lunch because I couldn't go into the commissary looking like that." The 6 distinct stages of the creature's deterioration had to be carefully mapped out for continuity purposes, scene by scene.
When our friend walked into my little spider's web, I said to myself, I think Frankenstein can...
Ashton was also responsible for creating 2 different severed heads of Jane Seymour, one for Agatha and the other for Prima, both created from the same facial mold. Seymour told me, "Yes, I did a death mask. They put straws up my nose so I could breathe. It was very claustrophobic, but pretty cool." The first one, for Agatha, is seen here in a large glass container filled with fluid. Special effects artist Brian Smithies explained, when the girl monster is being made, a dummy of Jane Seymour's body was submerged in a horizontal tank of fluid. For that, we had a metal frame tank with half-inch thick glass. In those days, we used putty as a sealant. But of course, putty always gets pushed out by the weight of the water, and the water runs all over the place. Well, they just invented this wonderful stuff called silicone rubber, and it sticks glass to itself. So we thought this would be ideal. We set up a tank, filled it with water, and it was wonderful. Not a leak anywhere. Then we added liquid paraffin wax for this sort of lava lamp effect. What we didn't know is that silicone rubber dissolves in petroleum-based products, so the water leaked even worse than before. There was a learning curve. In the early stages of development, Stromberg pointed out to the writers that the creation scenes in James Whale's Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein are almost identical. The male creature is on a table that rises to the roof, where kites are used to attract lightning, then lowered back down to the floor of the laboratory to see if the process worked. The same exact sequence of events was recreated for the female creature in Bride of Frankenstein, and even the camera angles and editing are very similar. Stromberg insisted that the creation scene for Prima, the female creature in Frankenstein the True Story, had to be completely unique and different from the solar-energized birth of the male creature. Inspired by Dr. Pretorius's use of chemicals and petri jars in Bride of Frankenstein, Stromberg told the writers to have Dr. Polidori use mysterious and colorful chemicals in large vats to conjure up an elixir of life, like the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. By the way, the 2 Chinese servants pumping the bellows were played by Kim Teo on the left and Tony Tin on the right, who later appeared together in the 6-part serial Doctor Who, The Talons of Wang Chang with Tom Baker. Tony Tin also appeared in the Rocky Horror Picture Show and on the series The New Avengers. The first assistant director, John Stoneman, recalled, "At one point, we had a plastic dummy of Jane Seymour that was in a bath in Frankenstein's laboratory. She was below the water. Jack said to me, 'It doesn't really look like a woman, does it? I think we should send it back to the makeup department and ask them to put some pubic hair on it.' I said, 'Well, I'm not doing it.' Anyway, off goes my second assistant, Peter Cotton, with a soaking wet dummy to take it to the makeup department, and yes, it came back with pubic hair on it, which of course could never have been shown on a television movie, so they then had to go take it off. It was hilarious. The special effects department created all the laboratory chemical potions, reactions, bubbles, and pyrotechnics. Colin Chilvers recalled, "We had Leonard Whiting toss a spoonful of sulfur into the vat of liquid that created fireworks and smoke. When Frankenstein tosses another chemical into the bath, they pump petroleum up from the bottom of the vat to burn on the surface of the water. From there, the body would be moved to marinate inside a rather phallic vertical test tube in which they plan to use a nude body double. Jane Seymour told me, "I was invited to look at a lineup of naked women and pick one as my stand-in." Colin Chilvers explained, "No one had anticipated that the water in a circular tube would act as a magnifier. Suddenly, this beautiful woman's body looked like an American football player, twice the width she was high." Brian Smithies told me, "We had to quickly create a thin cutout out of plywood and paint Jane Seymour as very thin and skinny. We used that as the figure in the test tube." Also, Seymour herself appeared in certain shots with no water at all, in slow motion, with fans blowing her hair to simulate underwater movement. Foreground glass tanks of liquid with bubbles and undulating blobs of lava lamp goop added to the illusion. When the process was complete, the only sign of Prima's metamorphosis was the scar around her neck, which could easily be disguised under decorative ribbon chokers. Stromberg felt that the contrast between Agatha and Prima should be heightened with opposing hair colors, innocent blonde for Agatha and malevolent brunette for Prima. Meanwhile, in mid-May, Michael Sarrazin suddenly disappeared from the production. Eventually, it was discovered that he had gone to France to see his girlfriend, actress Jacqueline Bisset. Hunt Stromberg was spitting nails, recalled the producer's secretary, Phyllis Alari. The entire production was on the brink of collapse. So, too, was the relationship between Sarrazin and Bisset. As reported in Vanity Fair magazine, she was having an affair with hairdresser to the stars John Peters, the direct inspiration for Warren Beatty's Casanova-like character in Shampoo. Shortly after Peters began his affair with Bisset, he flew back to California for a job interview with Barbra Streisand. The two fell madly in love, and Peters dumped Bisset like a hot potato. Miraculously, Bisset managed to reconcile with Sarrazin, and a week later, on May 23rd, he returned to work. During Sarrazin's absence, the production had to focus on scenes that did not involve his character, like the following sequences.
Well, they've been gone 4 months.
Oh, my dear children, welcome home. Elizabeth, how are you?
To show that there had been a passage of time, 4 months to be precise, for the honeymoon of Dr. Frankenstein and Elizabeth, makeup artist Roy Ashton applied a goatee to Leonard Whiting. But Frankenstein would soon return to his clean-shaven look. just as his carefree vacation would come to an abrupt end. His worst nightmare, Dr. Polidori, had used the time to insinuate himself and his female creature Prima into the Fanshawe household. In an interview for Radio Times, the co-screenwriter Christopher Isherwood revealed that the inspiration for Prima was the beautiful automaton in the opera Tales of Hoffmann. In this 1881 French opera, the protagonist falls in love with a ravishing beauty named Olympia, not knowing that she is a mechanical doll created by an inventor. I asked Jane Seymour about the differences between the farm girl and the female creature. She said, "Agatha is very ordinary and very human. On the other hand, I see Prima as an animal-like character because she acts entirely on her instincts with an extraordinary directness in everything she does. Polidori, on the other hand, has become the puppet master, pulling every string of his doll to advance his nefarious ambitions." Nicola Paget said, "James Mason was wonderful. I've never known anyone more honest than James, to the point of complete tactlessness. You know, his wife, Clarissa Kay, was in the movie playing my mother. Well, one time on set, James was watching her perform a scene, and he leaned over to me and said, 'Gosh, she's a terrible actress. Look at her. She can't act at all, can she?' Paget burst out laughing and said, 'He was terrible.'" I also asked Nicola about working with Jane Seymour. She said, "Jane always wanted to pursue her acting in America. That's where her heart was. Even though she was English, emotionally she was American, and that's where she was heading. I'm such a home bird. So we weren't alike at all in that way. One day she said, 'I'm going to Hollywood,' and I said, 'Well, I'm going to Cricklewood,' which is about as down market as you can get in London, you know." Regarding Leonard Whiting, Paget said, "It had been a few years since he'd done Romeo and Juliet, but we all still looked at him as Romeo. It was such a defining role for him. He was still successful, I think, at least for a little while, but then it all faded away, didn't it? But he's a sweet, sweet man, really lovely." This dinner scene was staged in the wood-paneled boardroom inside Heatherton Hall at Pinewood Studios, the very same room that was used for the office of Harvey Dent, played by Billy D. Williams in Tim Burton's Batman, and seen in many James Bond films, sometimes as the office of M. It was also prominently used in Jack Clayton's The Great Gatsby, starring Robert Redford and Mia Farrow. Regarding her role as Prima, Jane Seymour told me, "It was a very seductive role. Prima was very innocent, but at the same time she was a monster. I had played a lot of virgins. That's what I'd just played in the James Bond film as well. I'd had my fill of proper ladies. So this part was much more fun because she had an evil side to her." Seymour later won a Golden Globe Award for playing another wicked role in East of Eden. Seymour said, "When I compare pictures of myself in Frankenstein the True Story and East of Eden, I see a lot of similarities. The character of Kathy Ames had that same, 'Oh, I'm very innocent, but..."
Why did you do it? Come in.
Seymour added, James Mason made sure that his wife, Clarissa Kay, got a part in the movie as well. In makeup and hair, James and Clarissa would be there together, and he would read the London Times out loud to her with his very plummy voice. It was cool at first, but it became very distracting because I was trying to learn my lines. The music in this sequence is Ludwig van Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 23 in F minor, Opera 57, Appassionata. It was arranged by Philip Martel, the great Hammer film music supervisor, and pre-recorded for playback on set during shooting, including the mistake and frustrated slam on the piano keys at the end. Associate producer Ian Lewis was the one who hired Martel and assigned him several other pieces of music that had to be pre-recorded, including the violin solos for Ralph Richardson's role as the blind fiddler, an upcoming church service scene with everyone singing a hymn, and all the music for the ball where Prima would make her society debut. I asked Lewis if the earlier opera house scene in Part 1, featuring Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, was also on the list of pre-recordings. He said no, for that we used an existing recording and paid the licensing fee. Much cheaper than recording it because we would have needed to hire a legitimate opera singer. Jane Seymour commented, "I particularly liked my role because it had so many dimensions to it. Nikki Paget was not as pleased with her role as Elizabeth Frankenstein, and she told me one day that she wished she'd gotten mine." This scene was shot at St. Mary the Virgin Church in Hambledon Village, Buckinghamshire. The same church we saw at the beginning of Part 1 for the funeral of Frankenstein's brother. The traditional hymn, The Church's One Foundation, composed by Samuel Sebastian Wesley and Samuel L. Stone, was pre-recorded by Philip Martell. The actors and extras lip-synced to the playback track. Jane Seymour is standing in a pew with Michael Wilding and Clarissa Kay. Leonard Whiting and Nicola Paget are behind her. Across the aisle is a handsome young actor named Julian Barnes, who has eyes for Seymour. His credits include Horror House, Roddy McDowall's Tam Lin, The Rocketeer, Mars Attacks, and Pacific Rim. Barnes told me, "I first met the producer Hunt Stromberg Jr. socially through Alan Warren, an actor chum of mine who happened to be gay and later became a famous photographer. But anyway, Stromberg must have fancied me because I was summoned to audition for the role in Frankenstein. I got it, and then Hunt kept adding little extra bits for me. It was very nice of him."
I love little kitty.
In this scene, Elizabeth catches Prima trying to strangle a cat. I asked Jane Seymour how she safely faked it without hurting the animal, and she said, "Well, it wasn't easy, and I'm the one who ended up getting hurt. The cat managed to put his claws right through my costume and left nasty claw marks on my thighs. And the cat wasn't keen on doing more than one take. There was something else quite memorable about that bit, too. You're not going to believe this, but in the scene I sang, 'I love little pussy, my coat is so warm.' That's how I learned the song as a child. In England, it was an innocent lullaby about a pussy. Well, needless to say, when I sang that, everyone on the set fell apart laughing. And then Jack Smite, the director, came over to me and very politely said, 'I'd like you to sing it again, dear, only this time, if you'd be so kind, please transpose the word pussy to kitty.'" The producer, Hunt Stromberg Jr., was absolutely in charge of everything to do with the movie. With jolting candor, he told a reporter, "Frankenstein, the True Story is not a director's picture, it's a producer's picture. Think about it. The great movies were made in the days of great producers. Hal Wallace, Irving Thalberg, my father, to name just a few." I asked Jane Seymour if Stromberg's dominance over the director Jack Smite was unusual, and she said, "I didn't know any better at the time, you know. I'd just done Live and Let Die and was used to the producer, Harry Saltzman, telling the director, Guy Hamilton, what he did and didn't like, so this just seemed like the same thing, business as usual." Stromberg and Smite seemed to get along just fine. But about 3/4 through the shooting schedule, there were top-secret discussions among the upper echelon about the possibility of replacing the director. First Assistant Director John Stoneman was called in for a meeting with Hunt Stromberg, his partner Jacques Shelton, Associate Producer Ian Lewis, and Production Manager Brian Burgess. Stoneman told me, "I was asked if I would take over directing for a few days until a new director could be hired and flown in from Hollywood." When asked why Smite was on the chopping block, Stoneman said, "I was not given any specific reasons other than the production was falling behind schedule and in danger of going over budget. From what I'd seen, though, none of the problems were due to Jack. Stromberg had spent crazy amounts of money on the name actors in the cast, Sarrazin had gone AWOL, and the script was overly ambitious for the time and money at our disposal." I asked the production manager, Brian Burgess, about the situation, and he said, "There were times when Hunt and Jack didn't see eye to eye. They were total opposites. That may have had something to do with it." Stoneman was not told whom they had in mind to replace Smite, but the most likely candidate was Boris Sagal, who was under contract with Universal Television, and already well versed about the project. Declaring his loyalty to Smite, however, First Assistant Director Stoneman refused to act as an interim director. He said, "It was entirely wrong because it wasn't Jack that had put the movie behind schedule, so I said, no, I won't do it. That would be extremely disloyal of me to do to Jack, and I don't think you've got the right impression why we are behind schedule." Unfortunately, Jack got a couple of minor things wrong. We were shooting a scene in one particular direction on quite a large set. As you know, generally you shoot all the stuff in one direction and then change the lighting around so that you can shoot everything else you need in the opposite direction. Jack either forgot a shot or decided to add a shot from the direction we'd already completed, which meant that we had to go back and relight the direction we'd already done. It was further complicated because the walls of the set had to be removed and that sort of thing. It wasn't the most efficient use of time, but it's something that often happens on a film shoot. It's not unusual. But the incident was blown out of proportion as one of the reasons why the film was behind schedule. Another problem we had, a very big one, was when Michael Sarrazin disappeared. Michael was upset about something going on with his girlfriend, Jacqueline Bissett. He just up and left, leaving the production high and dry. Our worst nightmare. Stromberg said, "Don't worry about it. He'll be back. Just shoot something else." Well, it wasn't that easy. It threw the whole thing off. If you get behind on studio stages, you're in big trouble because other films are coming in to use those stages. Art directors, special effects people, and wardrobe people were coming to us and saying, "We're not ready for the scenes you now want to shoot." There was a lot of juggling around to do. So Jack Smite wound up in an unenviable position, to say the least. What was he supposed to shoot? And to make matters worse, we had no idea where Michael was, or how long he was going to be away, or even if he would ever return. Anyway, Sarrazin finally did come back about a week later, and we got our acts together, and off we went again. But somebody had to take the fall, I guess, and it wasn't going to be Michael Sarrazin. Politically, it was probably the worst thing I could have done to say my loyalty has to be with the director. But I have no regrets about that. It's a bit like being the first officer on a ship. If I had agreed to take over, I would have been undermining the captain of the ship. That's why I was so strongly opposed to it. Production manager Brian Burgess told me, at that point, the filming was too far along to reasonably replace a director. You can't. That's what you don't do. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed and everyone came to their senses. Instead, however, they let the first assistant director, John Stoneman, go, replaced by Brian Hurd, who had been the location manager on the British TV series The Protectors, starring Robert Vaughn. When asked why the higher-ups had turned on him, Stoneman reasoned, "It was my loyalty to Smite that did me in. First and foremost, they felt I should be loyal to the production, so that was that." Whatever complaints Stromberg and or Universal may have had with Jack Smite, they were soon forgiven and forgotten. Stromberg attached Smite to direct his next film, The Lady from the Land of the Dead, a mummy horror film scripted by Isherwood and Bacardi, with Jane Seymour and David McCallum attached to star for Universal TV and NBC, though sadly it never got made. And Universal confidently assigned Smite to such important, big-budget theatrical films as Airport 1975 and Midway. During post-production, Stromberg hired Gil Millay to do the score. In a 2017 interview I conducted with Millay's widow, Denise, she recalled, "Upon our arrival at the airport in London in August 1973, we saw a large sign that said Gil Millay, and there was Hunt and his chauffeur to greet us. Producers may have done that sort of thing for movie stars, but it was quite unexpected for a composer. Hunt was an extraordinary person, and he treated us like royalty." The director, Jack Smite, had to return to California to direct another TV movie, leaving Stromberg to oversee the creation of the music. Denise Millay told me, "Luckily, Hunt and Gil were in perfect sync. For the Rough Cuts temporary score, Hunt had used lush orchestral cues from movies like Dr. Zhivago, about as far removed from Andromeda Strain as you can get. Despite Gil's reputation as an electronic composer, he agreed 100% that the music for Frankenstein must be a purely symphonic orchestral score." In a profile of Millay for Little Shop of Horrors magazine, James Anthony Phillips wrote, "Stromberg had asked the composer to emphasize the romantic melodrama of the movie, including a searing emotional love theme between Dr. Frankenstein and his creature. Millay was quick to grasp the parallels between the characters in the movie and the writing team of Christopher Isherwood and Don Bacardi, gay partners wrestling with their own emotions over lost beauty and aging. Millay was no stranger to gay subject matter, having recently scored That Certain Summer, made by Universal Television, the groundbreaking 1972 TV movie with Hal Holbrook and Martin Sheen in a homosexual relationship, which won Emmy and Golden Globe Awards. Denise Millay added, after Gil had begun writing the music, Hunt made an appointment to come to our rented flat at Ossington Street and Moscow Road near Notting Hill Gate. He wanted to hear a sample composition, which of course made Gil very nervous. When Hunt arrived, Gil sat down at the piano and played Prima's theme, which Hunt immediately adored. From that moment on, Hunt trusted Gil implicitly and never asked to hear another note until the recording session. Millay had a special set of orchestra bells built for the recording. In a 2002 interview, Millay explained, I wanted to use these bells in the final scenes of the picture when they're sailing to the Arctic Circle. These bells were enormous, I'm telling you. That bell that went down to the low sea must have been 26 feet long. The interior of the laboratory, built on F Stage at Pinewood Studios, was actually set on fire, a controlled blaze that had to be extinguished after each take. The exterior of the lab was shot near Pinewood at a derelict barn at the old stable block on Dromina Farm in Ivor, Buckinghamshire. Alex Smythe, son of the director, confirmed that the foreground building was an existing edifice and that the skylight tower that rises from the rear was constructed by set builders. When the complex goes up in flames and explodes, it was a controlled blaze that burned the abandoned building to the ground. This was executed under the tight supervision of Langley's fire brigade and police department. Peter Melrose, who created matte paintings, title sequences, and/or scenic designs for such films as The Fearless Vampire Killers, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and later James Cameron's Aliens, meticulously hand-painted the Baroque wall designs throughout this ballroom set. Melrose told me Stromberg's aide, Jacques, who was always by his side, came over to me when I was painting the ballroom, and I thought to myself, uh-oh, they must not like it. I braced myself for the worst. Then Jacques opened his mouth and said, Hunt loves your decorations so much he'd like you to come over to America and paint some of that in our house. I was very relieved and very flattered. However, I politely declined. The cast and crew averaged about 65 people per day, plus extras, stand-ins, and stunt doubles as needed. For the week that the ballroom sequence was filmed, the head count bloated to 230 people per day. On the heavier days, Michael Farey was brought on as an additional third assistant director to help with crowd control. He told me, I would corral all the extras and tell them things like when they were permitted their lunch and tea breaks. My other duties included organizing a ham sandwich for James Mason or a chicken sandwich and black coffee for Agnes Moorehead. Well, someone had to do it. Julian Barnes, who played the young aristocrat with eyes for Prima, was present throughout the week in which the ball was being shot. He told me, my strongest memory is learning about Watergate. Between setups for the ballroom sequence, James Mason would hold court with all the other movie stars in the scene. The actors sat in this circle around him, and James, in his very distinctive timbre, would read articles from the Herald Tribune about the Watergate scandal, from start to finish. So there I sat, along with this amazing cast, being educated about Watergate by James Mason. It was wonderful. The walls of this ballroom set rose a precipitous 25 feet and had practical ceiling extensions when briefly needed for the widest angles. A giant chandelier was hung in the center of the room. Nevertheless, authenticity could only go so far. A double door opened at one end of the ballroom. Beyond that, a long hallway is visible in the background, or so it appears. Melrose explained, Stromberg wanted a hallway extension to be built full scale, but there was simply not enough room left on the stage to do it. So on canvas, I painted a large, forced perspective hallway backdrop that you can see outside those double doors. And there, you see the backdrop painting in the hallway behind those extras. In the Little Bo Peep getup is, of course, Margaret Leighton, the Countess we met in Part 1 at the Opera House. Stromberg wanted this brief encounter added so that she could appear in Part 2 as well. There was a writer's strike at the time that prevented Isherwood and Bacardi from writing this edition, so Stromberg did it himself. When the film was broadcast, the Los Angeles Times raved that Leighton's jewel-like bits as a nitwit noblewoman must literally be seen to be believed. Now the time has come for Prima's big show-stopping moment. Jeffrey Holder, the towering Trinidadian-American actor, dancer, choreographer, and the Uncola Nut pitchman for 7-Up commercials back then, was co-starring in Live and Let Die as a henchman who tries to sacrifice Jane Seymour in a voodoo occult ceremony. Holder was also serving as choreographer on the James Bond movie and had discovered during rehearsals that Seymour was a trained dancer. Holder recalled, "When Jane told me she'd been cast as the bride of Frankenstein and that the monster was going to tear off her head at a dance, I said, 'My dear, that sounds lovely, but have you told them what a great dancer you are?' Of course she hadn't, so I took it upon myself to corner Hunt Stromberg Jr., who was quite a character, as you know, and I said, 'Hunt, my darling, you have no idea what Jane is capable of doing. She's a prima ballerina. When the monster comes calling, she should be performing Salome's dance of the 7 veils. She must liberate her body before the monster liberates her head.' At first Hunt just stared at me like I'd lost all my marbles, but then he smiled wickedly and said, 'You may be right.' I knew I had struck a chord." In the original script, the party was a masquerade ball, and when the creature arrived, the guests thought he was another partygoer in a monster get-up. It was a clever idea, but Stromberg was worried it would resemble the ball from the Fearless Vampire Killers. He felt the actors would look silly in costumes, particularly Dr. Frankenstein as the harlequin jester that the writers had scripted him to be. Stromberg wanted the scene to be elegant and sophisticated, in stark contrast to the horror that was about to happen. So he changed it to a formal dance, and taking Holder's recommendation to heart, he added a solo ballet for Prima. To choreograph, they hired Sally Gilpin, who directed the dances in Roman Polanski's Macbeth and had previously been a dancer in Roger Corman's The Mask of the Red Death. The solo worked perfectly for the character because Prima was a supreme mimic. All it took was one viewing of a ballet performance for her to master it. The creature's surprise entrance proved to be a much more dramatic disruption than merely interrupting a conversation as originally scripted. This was another example of Stromberg's keen instinct for heightening the drama. In the essay About Our Frankenstein Screenplay, Isherwood and Bacardi wrote, "Polidori also creates a creature, an exquisite young girl, intelligent, charming, heartless, who isn't about to deteriorate. His motives for making her are the worst possible. She is to be the instrument of his insane ambition. It is a paradox of our story that Frankenstein's misshapen, murderous creature seems ultimately noble, while Polidori's remains a mere, beautiful reptile and gets killed like one." With excruciating irony, this was the first scene that Michael Sarrazin shot after his week-long disappearance, during which he had discovered that his real-life girlfriend had been cheating on him. Method acting was never put to better use. If success can be gauged by water cooler moments, this movie delivered them by the 5-gallon tank load on both nights, with this jaw-dropping set piece at the top of the list. critic for Time Out New York magazine agreed. He wrote, "The most talked about sequence was the glorious moment of delirium when the monster disrupts a society ball to collect his bride, ripping off her choker to reveal a stitched neck, then annexing her head as his property." The national conversation, at least among fans of the genre, was dominated by this film for weeks, particularly this shocking moment. It was astounding that the censors allowed it at all. What they did demand, however, was that the gore had to be minimized. The butchered theatrical version of the film that was released in Europe, with only a 2-hour running time, does, however, show us the uncensored footage as it was originally intended. Film archivist Philippe Spirel wrote, "When the creature removes Prima's head from her body, the shot is slightly wider and held on the screen a few beats longer, allowing us to clearly see the bloody entrails hanging below her neck." About halfway through the shoot, they realized that the running time was turning out to be much longer than expected, plus they were slipping behind schedule and in danger of going over budget. In the original script, the beheading was followed by a lynch mob in the town square where the creature is held captive in a cave, his daring escape across rooftops, Dr. Frankenstein's incarceration at the local jail where Polidori persuades the chief of police to release him into his care, a seaport dock sequence where the ship is loaded and launched, and a Coast Guard boat chase at the outer waters of its jurisdiction. In a memo to Universal, Stromberg wrote, "Instinct tells me we should find a way to go straight from the mayhem at the ball to the ship, omitting the whole jail sequence, the rooftops, etc." Universal agreed. Due to the writer's strike, it was left up to Stromberg to devise a simple, cost-effective bridge between the catastrophe at the ball and the ship at sea. This connecting thread involved Elizabeth manipulating the chief constable into dropping charges against Dr. Frankenstein. Of course, Stromberg cast no less than Sir John Gielgud to play the chief constable in this one-scene cameo. First Assistant Director John Stoneman recalled, "Gielgud had a glorious time that day. He thought the whole thing was a crazy jaunt. I remember him coming onto the set dressed in a cape, which of course must have been his idea. After Gielgud interviews Leonard Whiting and Nicola Paget, he walks over to a junior policeman. I'll never forget it. He threw out his cape in this very flamboyant way and said to the junior policeman, 'Are you doing anything later tonight?' I mean, everybody, from the electricians to the camera grips, we all fell apart." The great comic actor Peter Glaze, known in the UK for the long-running comedy series Crackerjack, played the junior policeman. Stoneman added, "I remember the look on Peter's face was so funny. The more experienced actors treated it as great fun." Isherwood later grumbled about this scene, causing many to assume that every word of dialogue spoken between the chief constable and Elizabeth came from Stromberg. The truth, however, is that the dialogue is largely a cut-and-paste pastiche of lines from an excise scene written by Isherwood and Bacardi at the police station, during which Dr. Polidori manipulates the chief constable into dropping charges against Dr. Frankenstein, which, by the way, had a fatal flaw in logic. Earlier in the story, it had been established time and again that Polidori possessed hypnotic powers, and, therefore, could have just hypnotized the chief constable into releasing Dr. Frankenstein. So, despite Isherwood's objections, it made much more sense for Elizabeth to manipulate the chief constable using her own verbal powers of persuasion, which, at the same time, made her character less passive. Ultimately, when compared to Isherwood and Bacardi's authorized published teleplay, Stromberg's embellishments to the final film were not as numerous as one might suspect, and were far outweighed by the trims he had to make in order to rein in the length and budgetary concerns. Gielgud, who was 68 at the time, had been Oscar-nominated for Beckett and later won an Oscar for Arthur. He'd won a BAFTA for Julius Caesar and would soon win a second BAFTA for Murder on the Orient Express. He would go on to win 2 Golden Globes, one for Arthur and the other for the Dan Curtis miniseries War and Remembrance, and an Emmy for Summer's Lease. Jack Smite was a bit intimidated to be directing a legend as formidable as Gielgud, but the actor knew how to put the director at ease. Smite's son, Alec, recalled, Gielgud walked right up to my dad and said, "My dear fellow, I'm often very bad, and I'd appreciate it if you'd tell me so." Though Gielgud never publicly came out, it was common knowledge that he was gay. In 1953, he'd been scandalously arrested and fined for lewd conduct in a men's lavatory, but his fans stood by him and the brouhaha eventually blew over. Associate producer Ian Lewis told me, "Hunt wrote that scene for Gielgud. I said, we can't afford him, but Hunt said, I want him. Hunt offered him quite a lot of money, and the studio thought that a name like Gielgud was worth it, so we got him." Say what you will about Stromberg, but the cast for Frankenstein the True Story was nothing but sublime, and for that he deserves a hell of a lot of credit. If there had been more available parts, who knows what might have happened. In a November 1973 interview for the Los Angeles Times, Stromberg lamented, "I later ran into Alec Guinness and Robert Morley, and they both asked, why didn't I call them?"
Victor, please. I can't have the baby here after all this. Please pull yourself together. The ship leaves in a few hours.
The ship? What ship?
The ship my father's hired to take us to America. I won't have our baby here.
This ship at sea was a model traversing rolling waves in a huge tank of water. Several other shots like it are soon to follow. These are exactly the kinds of shots Brian Smithies would later craft for other films, so the assumption has been that Smithies must have created these shots for Frankenstein the True Story. I asked Smithies about it, and he said, "When I recently rewatched the film, those shots reminded me of the model ship shots I created of the Demeter for Dracula with Frank Langella. In fact, the shots were so similar, at first I thought they must have added those shots to Frankenstein at a later date for the DVD release or something, borrowed from Dracula. But then, when the ship nearly tips over, I knew it wasn't anything I had done." Asked if it was possible that someone else on the Frankenstein the True Story effects team might have created those model shots without his knowledge, Smithy said, "No, anything involving models, I would have known about it." I discovered a clue to this mystery in a pre-production memo dated February 27, 1973, recommending that, to save money, the schooner at sea shots could be stock footage borrowed from another movie. If that was indeed the case, I have yet to pinpoint the film in question. It would most likely have come from a Universal picture, like the curtain call footage borrowed for free from The Phantom of the Opera. If anyone manages to find a match, I'd love to hear about it. Seriously, you can find me on Facebook or write to me, care of Little Shop of Horrors magazine.
I happen to be in a position to know more about our stalwart captain than your father, Mrs. Frankenstein. I know, for example, that he's served several prison sentences, once in Spain, once in France, and twice in Germany.
Poor man.
I think we can rely on him.
As originally written, the ship at sea sequences were going to break the budget. But Stromberg, having witnessed boats being filmed on his father's movies, knew exactly how to solve the problem. In a memo to his troops, Stromberg instructed, "Please delete the lifeboats surrounding the vessel near the end of the script, as these lifeboats would entail us actually being on water. Minus the lifeboats, it is my personal feeling that the ship sequence can be done on a soundstage in the atmosphere of a densely foggy and stormy night." He was dead right. So the schooner sets were erected inside A stage at Pinewood Studios, where the scenes were shot over the course of 6 days in June 1973. The deck and cabin sets were placed on a hydraulic rocking gimbal that was rented from Jim Hole, the special effects supervisor on Moby Dick, Billy Budd, Orca, and the pirate spoof Carry On Jack. About halfway through, the rocking mechanism broke, and the rest of the shots had to be cheated with a handheld camera and the actors simulating the rocking movement. Poor man's process, as it is commonly called, like the actors frequently did on the original 1960s Star Trek series. Tony Aiken, who played Sailor No. 3, told me, "In synchronization, we would sway from one side to the other as though the ship was moving, rocking from side to side like a bunch of goons. It was very funny." Nicola Paget agreed. It was very funny, and if you look closely, I'm trying desperately not to laugh because we had to pretend it was rocking. So instead of the ship moving, we moved, and we nearly got the giggles because we felt so stupid. We just managed to hold on until they said cut. Then we all burst out laughing. They attached super thin tungsten wire to the hanging lanterns to make them sway back and forth, to further the illusion that the set was rocking. It was the same wire, not visible to the camera, that was used in part 1 to make the butterfly airborne. Oh, and there's another one of those mystery stock shots of the ship. Anyway, Michael Sarrazin gave a wonderful performance as the creature. Sadly, in later years, he developed cancer and passed away at age 70 in 2011. His co-stars were in awe of him. Leonard Whiting told me, "Michael was a tremendously underrated actor, don't you agree? I thought in some of the scenes he had such tremendous pathos. We were all very impressed with him. Off camera, he was sort of kooky in a way. He was very American in the sense that he almost behaved like a cartoon, like Tom and Jerry or something." I asked Nicola Paget about him, and she told me, "Well, with Michael Sarrazin, I'd seen They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And I thought it was a fantastic movie, absolutely brilliant. And I thought of him as a huge Hollywood movie star, untouchable. But of course, in reality, he wasn't like that at all. I just thought he was, because he never used to come to lunch with the rest of us in the dining room. He seemed like a loner to me, and not very sociable. As the years went on, and I got over being starstruck by Hollywood movie stars, I understood how I had completely misinterpreted everything about Sarrazin. He didn't come to lunch with us in the dining room because he didn't want everyone to see him looking so ugly in his monster makeup." Years ago, film archivist Philippe Spirel spoke to Sarrazin about the movie and recalled, "Michael said that of all the films he's done, Frankenstein the True Story is the one that he is asked most about. He said that when he was making the movie, he was in awe of all the talented people around him, and he felt a bit inferior by comparison." Critics adored his performance. In The Hollywood Reporter, Sue Cameron raved, "Bravo! Michael Sarrazin as the creature should receive an Emmy nomination. It is the finest work he has ever done. He instills humanity, warmth, compassion, and all sorts of emotions we don't usually see in a creature. He was fabulous." Mark Gatiss, co-creator of the series Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch, was likewise affected by his performance. He wrote, "Sarrazin is inexpressibly moving as he first catches sight of his beautiful features in decay. His haunted vulnerability takes the acting honors." Sarrazin's brother, Pierre, told me, "Michael was very proud of his performance, and it ranks up there with his finest work. He was a wonderful actor, but more importantly, he was a kind, gentle man. I am comforted that he is remembered this way." In a 1973 interview for the San Francisco Chronicle, Michael Sarrazin himself stated, "The thing about the creature that is most challenging is that he should evoke sympathy. You should care about him, and to make this happen without dialogue. I think we brought it off. Jack Smite did a marvelous job. Somehow, no matter how hideous the creature becomes, it doesn't repulse you." Stromberg was forever dreaming up new ideas. Leonard Whiting told me, "One time, Hunt came in and had sort of a script meeting with me and James Mason. He said to James, 'Look, I have an idea. After the creature comes in and rips Prima's head off, we never show what happened to the head. So what about this? When you're on the ship traveling to the North Pole, the creature comes to you and gives you a hat box. You open the hat box, grab hold of what's inside, and pull out the head of Prima.'" I looked at James. There was this very long pause. Then very calmly, in that marvelous James Mason voice, he said, "Well, Hunt, I'm not going to do that." That was such a funny moment because, this is James Mason, somebody who was so known and famous. He had the most extraordinary sense of humor where he'd say something and then about 5 minutes later, when it sunk in, it would make you roll up with laughter.
You have no other choice.
Are you sure?
My servant is up on deck. Tell him to hurry.
As originally scripted, there was a guest role of the American captain of the ship, who had several juicy scenes, including one meaty tete-a-tete with Polidori as they are being chased by the Coast Guard. Although it was cut and never shot, This will give you an idea of what might have been. Here is a brief excerpt from Isherwood and McCarty's script. Exterior, deck of ship, night. The ship is now several miles out to sea, heading toward America. It is becoming foggy, and the shore is no longer visible. Polidori and the captain stand at the rail. A light appears, flashing dimly through the fog. Captain. There's the Coast Guard cutter. They're signaling that we should heave to. Polidori. What can they possibly want? Captain. You tell me, Doctor. Looks like it's you or your friends. Maybe I'm carrying cargo that is more valuable than I was given to understand. Polidori. If it's a question of additional charges, I'm sure we can arrange that between us. Do you have to stop for them? Captain. I could tell you were in a hurry the first minute you came aboard. Don't you worry about those limeys. They won't follow us much farther. There's fog ahead. Why should we kowtow to them? This ship is a 100-foot piece of the United States, the land of the free. Polidori. God bless America. Captain. You're going to feel right at home in our country, Doctor. Over there, a man like you can go a long way. End of scene. Jack Smite, who had just directed Oscar winner Ernest Borgnine in the Universal TV movie Legend in Granite, the Vince Lombardi story, suggested that Borgnine would be ideal for the American captain of the ship. It would have been a bit of typecasting given Borgnine's many maritime credits, including Torpedo Run, Ice Station Zebra, The Poseidon Adventure, The Neptune Factor, and the series McHale's Navy. Stromberg loved the idea and promptly offered Borgnine the part, which the actor readily accepted. However, in the process of truncating the scripted scenes for the ship sequences, the role of the American captain had to be drastically reduced. Stromberg informed Borgnine that, with fewer shooting days and less screen time, they were going to have to renegotiate his fee accordingly. Borgnine respectfully bowed out. Stromberg was very sad to lose one of his big-name, Oscar-winning stars, but it saved the production money, and it gave him the opportunity to make nice with an actor he'd kind of screwed over when they were casting the creature, Tom Baker. In a 2014 interview for Hollywood News, Baker recalled, "They ended up giving the role of the monster to a very good-looking actor. Instead, they gave me the part of the ship's captain." Stromberg decided to make the captain British so that Baker would not have to fake an American accent. Actor Tony Aiken, who played Sailor No. 3, told me, "There was this Merlin engine, a beautiful ex-World War II submarine Spitfire bomber engine, which was mounted on a scaffold. They would fire it up, and the 8-foot propeller would drive out this huge amount of wind. Dump tanks dropped water in front of it, which resulted in this sideways spray at 80 miles an hour coming at you. So Tom Baker, myself, and the other sailors were out on the deck with passengers including Nicola Paget, Leonard Whiting, James Mason, and Michael Sarrazin. Tom got a bit grumpy about it because, as the captain, he had to do an awful lot of shouting while the Merlin engine was blowing gallons of water in his face. Well, as you can imagine, every time he opened his mouth, it immediately filled up with water, and he'd be choking from it, unable to breathe, much less talk. Leonard Whiting told me, "The water stuff was good, wasn't it? It was supposed to be a storm at sea, and they poured thousands of gallons of water on our heads." Listen closely to the voice coming out of Michael Sarrazin's mouth. What you are hearing is actually David McCallum's voice, because, after all, the brain of his character, Dr. Henry Clerval, had been transplanted into the creature's head. Up until now, the creature had been suffering from amnesia, but as that condition wears off, the mind of Clerval has rejuvenated and is taking over the creature's actions and his words. He taunts Polidori with the castrating nickname Polly Dolly, which we heard Clerval call him in Part 1. It was Stromberg's idea to have David McCallum go into a recording studio and post-dub Sarrazin's dialogue and his cackles in this vengeful, murderous sequence. With Clerval's brain now fully conscious and in charge, the creature hoists his former mentor and lover, Polidori, to the top of the mast, then watches gleefully as the lightning bolt literally zaps Polidori to a crisp. Listen as McCallum's voice is heard coming from the creature's mouth.
Easy,
Oh, Polly darling, was this a sugar daddy entanglement gone horribly wrong? When I asked the co-writer, Don Bacardi, he gave me a wicked smile and said, "You are not mistaken." Suddenly, Frankenstein is knocked off the yardarm and falls to the deck, unconscious. Elizabeth rushes to his aid. However, the creature, with Clerval's brain calling the shots, jumps down onto the deck, crosses to Elizabeth, and brutally tosses her aside. He lifts Frankenstein into his arms, pulling him away from the storm and all the others on deck. The creature carries him inside and down the stairs to the cabin below. Then he gently and lovingly lays him on the bed. All that's missing is a cutaway to Hitchcock's North by Northwest train penetrating a tunnel. All right. I'll try to be more dignified. Moving right along. Video watchdog critic Kim Newman believes that John Badham's Dracula, made 6 years later, drew inspiration from Frankenstein the True Story by the way in which Dracula, played by Frank Langella, was violently hoisted up the mast of the ship to be burned by sunrise, in the strikingly similar way in which Dr. Polidori was violently hoisted up the mast of the ship to be struck by lightning. For Little Shop of Horrors magazine number 36, film historian Konstantin Nasser asked director John Badham and screenwriter W.D. Richter about this supposition, but they, quote, didn't specifically recall even seeing the film or intentionally swiping the concept. Nevertheless, both films were produced in England by Universal under the studio supervision of Ian Lewis and a few crossover crew members. It seems unfathomable that there could have been collective amnesia. By the way, 7 years later, after Tom Baker had become a huge star playing Doctor Who, Stromberg hired him again to play the villainous Hassan in The Curse of King Tut's Tomb, a 2-part NBC TV miniseries starring 3 Oscar winners, Eva Marie Saint, Wendy Hiller, and Paul Scofield, plus Emmy winner Raymond Burr, Robin Ellis of Poldark fame, Angharad Rees, star of the Hammer film Hands of the Ripper, and Harry Andrews from Theater of Blood and Superman, with a score by Frankenstein the True Story's Gil Millet. On May 23, 1973, with another 6 weeks left of shooting, Stromberg sent a memo to all members of the cast and crew that read, "Universal is a conservative company, highly circumspect, not given to lavish praise. Accordingly, I was both amazed and obviously very pleased for all of us when last night I was told that the 1 hour and 25 minutes of film, which we recently sent to Universal Studios in California, is described by the key Universal executives in one word: fantastic. Everyone connected with the picture, obviously, shares in this one-word comment." Exactly 2 weeks later, triggered in part by the extraordinary buzz Frankenstein the True Story was generating throughout the industry, the project's godfather, Universal Television president Sid Sheinberg, was elected president and chief operating officer of MCA Universal to serve alongside chairman Lou Wasserman. He would now be in charge of all the studio's projects, television and theatrical. This promotion boded well for Stromberg, who was developing a number of follow-up projects for the studio, or so he hoped. One of those was The Legend of King Kong, a big-budget theatrical remake of the RKO classic to be faithfully set in the 1930s, from a script by Bo Goldman, Oscar winner for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, to be directed by Joseph Sargent, who did Colossus, the Foreman Project, after hot off of Jaws Steven Spielberg turned it down to direct Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and to be presented in Sense-Around, the low-frequency vibrating gimmick Universal developed for Earthquake. Jim Danforth, who created the stop-motion dinosaurs for the Hammer film When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, was on board to do the special effects. After months of preparations, Stromberg's project suddenly imploded when Paramount and producer Dino De Laurentiis announced their own remake to be set in the present day, with Kong climbing the twin towers of New York's then-new World Trade Center. Both studios insisted they owned the remake rights, but upon closer examination, the actual contracts turned out to be a tangled quagmire of contradictions, loopholes, and misrepresentations. Lawsuits erupted, out-of-court settlements were negotiated. Universal and Paramount ended up co-presenting the modern one that got made with Jessica Lange in The Big Boy's Paw. Dino De Laurentiis produced. The loser in all this? Stromberg, who was unceremoniously kicked to the curb. At the risk of career suicide, he sued Universal for a share of the 17.5% box office gross the studio had negotiated for itself. In a 1977 letter to a friend, Stromberg wrote, "I got so many cold shoulders for doing that, you'd think I was the bad guy, and now the supervillain in the new James Bond movie is named after me." Indeed, Bond's nemesis in The Spy Who Loved Me was a megalomaniac named Stromberg, played by Kurt Jurgens. A direct reference? In 2014, screenwriter Christopher Wood replied, "Yes, I knew Hunt and borrowed his name because it sounded Teutonic and powerful. He was highly amused when he saw the movie." The Arctic climax for Frankenstein the True Story was the first time the icy northern wastelands of Shelley's novel had ever been depicted in a Frankenstein film. These sets were perhaps the most challenging to pull off because they appear in broad daylight, which is not very forgiving. When Frankenstein regains consciousness in his cabin aboard the ship, the boat is dead still, having been embedded in ice. Curiously, he climbs on deck to find everything covered in snow and frost, and no sign of life anywhere. As he looks around, he suddenly discovers Elizabeth, dead, frozen solid, along with their unborn child. Colin Chilvers recalled, "To achieve the look of a frozen corpse, we used a Venturi spray gun to spray hot paraffin wax over Nicola Paget. The wax beads up like the inside of a freezer after it has frosted up." The art department had to create a daytime backdrop for the vast oceanic ice shelf and distant glaciers. In one shot of Frankenstein on the deck of the ship, the creature can be seen in the deep background heading toward a cave in a faraway mountain of ice. This was accomplished via chroma key compositing with a blue screen backdrop. Once Frankenstein has left the ship and is walking toward the grotto, the art department created an expansive set with the vast snow shelf and the schooner stuck in the ice floe. Front projection shots were created by Wally Vevers and Charles Staffel, the world's foremost pioneers of this technology, who had previously worked their magic on 2001: A Space Odyssey. Brian Smithies explained, "When Leonard Whiting is walking away from the boat on the ice and you see the ship behind him, we made a quarter-size model ship for the false perspective background. The hull was a painted cutout, which then had realistic masts and rigging added on top. Colin Chilvers and I worked on the rigging. Scenic artist Peter Melrose told me, I painted the cutout of that hull. I also painted the sky backdrop and the matte paintings of the Arctic wasteland for perspectives in both directions, angles looking toward the ship stuck in the ice, and the reverse angles looking toward the snowy mountain with the grotto at its base where the creature was waiting." Once Frankenstein reaches the creature, they stand inside the icy grotto that was built outside on Pinewood's backlot as a full-scale set. Colin Chilvers recalled, "The ice cave was huge. It was approximately 60 feet wide, about 30 feet high, and at least 30 feet deep. The construction and plastering department had carved the ice walls out of styrofoam. Chilvers told me, inside the grotto, I built a rig whereby wire cables were anchored to the ground and to the top of the cave at different angles. Fixed onto those wires were huge styrofoam ice rocks ready to fall on cue. When Michael Sarrazin and Leonard Whiting entered the cave, there was a safe area where they were instructed to stand. When the director cued for the avalanche to begin, I just cut the wires so that the styrofoam ice collapsed in on itself. After reviewing the dailies, Stromberg felt the manufactured collapse looked fake because there was not enough dead weight to the styrofoam boulders, so they never used this particular effect. The reunion of Dr. Frankenstein and the creature he had abandoned was gut-wrenching.
I'm a weak human. I can't stay long in this terrible place. But your iron body will keep you alive against your will. You'll be all alone here. That would be too cruel. Forgive me. Please forgive me. Forgive me! Beautiful.
Beautiful in the flashback is spoken with Sarrazin's own voice.
Victor.
The word Victor is David McCallum's voice, speaking through the creature as Clerval.
Victor.
It's David McCallum's voice again, right up to the end.
Bravo, Victor.
Then they embrace for the final act of double suicide. Instead of the styrofoam collapse, they used a series of authentic stock footage shots of glacial cliffs collapsing into the ocean. At the end of the original script, there was an epilogue in which the iceberg drifts south and is melting in the Arctic summer. Suddenly, a fissure in the ice breaks apart. Working its way through the crack, the creature's hand appears, its fingers open like a flower blooming as it feels the sunlight. This, however, was never filmed. Stromberg simply didn't like the open ending. He felt it was a setup for a non-existent sequel that undermined and cheapened the poignant, tragic ending to his love story, like Romeo and Juliet. One of the film's biggest fans is author Anne Rice. She explained, "Frankenstein: The True Story directly inspired me to write Interview with the Vampire. It contained unforgettable images and ideas. The movie had such a profound influence on my writing that I wonder what I would have written had I not seen this. It was horror the way I longed to see horror done, with depth, dignity, beauty, and seriousness." Oscar winner Guillermo del Toro counts Frankenstein: The True Story among his top 100 favorite films of all time list, describing it as quirky, brilliant, and moving. He cited the movie as one of the inspirations behind his Best Picture Oscar-winning film, The Shape of Water. And that concludes this deep dive into the history behind Frankenstein: The True Story. I'm Sam Irvin.